Grace Mitchell tightened the old silver phoenix pin on her groom's jacket, just as laughter rippled through the ballroom. "Move the wheelchair farther back," one wealthy relative called with a smile. "Let's keep the wedding pictures elegant." A pair of groomsmen rolled Daniel toward the edge of the platform, as if he were furniture instead of the man she had just promised to love. Around them, crystal glasses sparkled, expensive suits shifted awkwardly, and dozens of guests lowered their eyes. Not one person stepped forward. Not one voice said, "Enough." Grace could have argued. She could have walked away. Instead, she quietly rolled Daniel back beside her, smoothed his jacket, and met his eyes with the same gentle smile that had carried them this far. Across the room, an elderly concierge suddenly froze when he noticed the tiny silver phoenix pinned to Daniel's lapel. His expression changed, but he remained silent. The family believed they were humiliating a poor black woman, foolish enough to marry a man in a wheelchair. They had no idea that one forgotten symbol was about to awaken a truth powerful enough to turn their laughter into silence. And before this story is over, the very people who mocked Grace will wish they had been the first to stand beside her. By the time Grace Mitchell reached the last row of white folding chairs, every conversation on the lawn had died. The country club sat on a green rise outside Charlotte, all stone columns, clipped hedges, and tall windows shining beneath the hard blue sky. White roses climbed the wedding arch. A string quartet played beneath a row of old oaks. Beyond the terrace, the golf course rolled away in perfect green bands, smooth enough to make the entire afternoon look staged. Grace did not look staged. She wore a simple ivory gown with long sleeves and no glittering train. Her hair was pinned back with small pearl combs borrowed from a woman at the public library where she worked. Her shoes had been repaired twice. Her bouquet held gardenias, eucalyptus, and 3 white roses from the small flower shop near her apartment. Both hands rested on the handles of Daniel Brooks's wheelchair. Daniel wore a dark navy suit cut carefully around his seated frame. He was 38, broad through the shoulders, with a quiet face that revealed very little unless Grace was near him. Then something softened around his eyes. An old silver pin shaped like a phoenix rested on his left lapel. Grace had polished it that morning with the corner of a cotton handkerchief. They moved together down the aisle. Whispers followed them like wind through dry leaves. "That's her? She's the librarian? I heard she lives near West Boulevard. Such a shame about Daniel. Such a strange choice for a woman her age." Grace heard enough to understand the rest. She kept walking. Daniel's right hand rested on his thigh. His left gripped the arm of the chair so tightly that the knuckles had gone pale. "You all right?" Grace asked under the music. He glanced up at her. "I should be asking you." "I'm not the one trying to bend a steel armrest." His fingers loosened. That small victory was enough to carry her the rest of the way. At the front of the lawn, Daniel's aunt, Evelyn Brooks, stood beside the wedding planner with a smile too carefully arranged to be kind. Evelyn was 62, silver-haired, elegantly dressed, and accustomed to being obeyed before she finished a sentence. She had organized most of the ceremony after declaring that Grace's original plans were too informal for the family name. As Grace approached, Evelyn stepped forward. "Hold there," she said. The quartet kept playing, but several musicians looked up. Grace stopped. Evelyn turned to the wedding planner. "The chair needs to be farther right." The planner blinked. "Mrs. Brooks, the marks were set during rehearsal." "I can see that." Evelyn lowered her voice without lowering it enough. "It blocks the floral line in the photographs." Daniel looked at the arch, then at the spot Evelyn indicated. It was nearly 3 feet from where Grace would stand, close to the edge of the platform, and partly behind a pillar wrapped in greenery. Grace's hands remained on the wheelchair. "The chair stays beside me," she said. Evelyn's smile tightened. "Why? It is only for the ceremony photographs. The ceremony is our marriage. A few guests shifted in their seats. No one spoke. Evelyn looked toward Daniel, expecting him to settle the matter. "Daniel?" He lifted his chin. "I'm staying beside my wife." The word wife changed Grace's breathing. Not dramatically, just enough that she had to press her thumb against the worn leather handle of the chair. Evelyn gave the wedding planner a small nod, the kind that promised the argument would continue elsewhere. "Very well," she said. "Let us avoid further delays." Grace rolled Daniel into place. As she stepped around to stand beside him, she noticed the phoenix pin had tilted. She bent slightly and straightened it. The metal was cool beneath her fingers. Near the entrance to the terrace, an elderly black man in a dark green concierge jacket stopped carrying a tray of champagne glasses. His name tag read Samuel Price. He stared at the pin. One glass rattled softly against another. A younger server whispered something to him, but Samuel did not respond. His eyes moved from the silver phoenix to Daniel's face, then back again. Grace noticed his expression. Daniel did too. For 1 second, something passed between the two men. Recognition, fear, or perhaps an old memory. Then Samuel lowered his eyes and continued toward the terrace. The officiant opened his folder. The guests settled. Grace looked across the lawn and saw the room she had entered by marrying Daniel. Old money sat beneath white umbrellas. Men in summer suits wore watches that flashed whenever they lifted a glass. Women in pastel dresses studied Grace's gown, her skin, her hands, and the modest ring Daniel had placed on her finger during a courthouse ceremony 6 weeks earlier. Some looked curious. Some looked amused. Most looked away when Grace met their eyes. There were people from Grace's side too, though not many. Her supervisor from the library sat near the back with 2 co-workers. Mrs. Loretta Gaines, 71, from the apartment downstairs, wore a violet hat and held a tissue in one hand. Marcus Reed, a retired bus mechanic Grace often helped with medical forms, sat stiffly in a borrowed jacket. They had not come to inspect Daniel. They had come because Grace had asked them. That difference warmed her. The officiant began. He spoke about companionship, patience, and the courage to choose another person fully. Grace heard each word. She also heard the soft scrape of chairs whenever someone turned for a better look at Daniel. When the officiant asked Daniel to repeat his vows, his voice was calm. "Grace, before you, I had learned how to live without expecting kindness. You made kindness feel ordinary again." Her throat tightened. He continued, "I cannot promise you an easy life. I can promise that no part of me will ever consider your dignity negotiable." Across the aisle, Evelyn looked down. Grace took Daniel's hand. "Daniel, I do not need an easy life," she said. "I need an honest one. I promise to stand beside you when rooms are loud, when people are cruel, and when silence is worse than either one." Several guests glanced at one another. Daniel's eyes held hers. For a moment, the country club disappeared. No whispered insults, no expensive lawn, no family name weighing down the afternoon. Only the man who had listened when Grace spoke. Only the woman who had never looked away from his chair. The officiant pronounced them husband and wife. Applause rose unevenly. Grace bent and kissed Daniel. Mrs. Gaines stood first, then Marcus Reed, then Grace's co-workers. The Brooks family remained seated for 2 long seconds before joining with light, polite clapping. The sound bothered Grace less than she expected. She had not come for their approval. The reception moved indoors beneath chandeliers and warm amber lights. Crystal glasses caught the sun from the western windows. A jazz trio played near the fireplace. Waiters moved through the ballroom with silver trays of crab cakes and sparkling wine. Grace and Daniel entered to an announcement that barely survived the room's scattered applause. "Mr. and Mrs. Daniel Brooks." Grace smiled. Daniel leaned toward her. "You still have time to run." She looked at the polished floor ahead. "In these shoes?" His laugh was low and surprised. It was the first genuine sound either of them had made since arriving. Then the photographer approached. "Family portraits first," she said. Evelyn appeared at once. Brooks' family by the fireplace. Grace moved behind Daniel's chair. Evelyn held up one hand. "We'll begin with blood relatives." The photographer's expression changed. Only slightly. Grace stepped back. Daniel turned his chair toward his aunt. "Grace is my family." "Of course she is," Evelyn said. "We simply need one traditional photograph first." A cousin named Preston Brooks laughed from beside the mantel. "Let's not make the poor woman stand around," he said. "She'll have plenty of standing to do over the next 40 years. A few men chuckled. Grace understood the joke before Preston added, "Someone has to push him." The laughter grew. Daniel's face went still. Grace placed one hand on his shoulder. The room had heard. The photographer had heard. The servers had heard. The guests near the bar had heard. No one defended them. Grace looked slowly across the ballroom. Faces turned toward glasses, phones, centerpieces, anywhere but her. Silent witnesses everywhere. Evelyn cleared her throat. "Preston, that is enough." But she said it with the mild irritation of someone correcting bad table manners, not cruelty. Preston raised his champagne. "It was a joke." Grace smiled at him. Not warmly, not angrily, simply with the calm of a woman who had survived enough to know that some people exposed themselves best when nobody interrupted. "I hope it was worth telling," she said. The laughter stopped. The photographer lowered her camera. For the first time, Preston looked uncertain. Grace moved beside Daniel and faced the lens. "If there is going to be a family photograph," she said, "then the family will be in it." Daniel's hand found hers. The photographer lifted the camera again. Behind them, Samuel Price stood near the ballroom doors. He was no longer carrying a tray. His eyes remained fixed on the silver phoenix pin. Then he reached slowly into his jacket and took out an old phone. Across the room, Evelyn tapped a spoon against her champagne glass. "Before dinner," she announced, smiling toward the crowd, "I would like to offer a toast to my nephew and his very courageous bride." Something in the way she said courageous made Grace's hand tighten around Daniel's. The ballroom quieted. Evelyn raised her glass, and Daniel whispered, almost too softly for Grace to hear, "Whatever she says next, don't let go of me." Grace looked down at him. "I wasn't planning to." At the doorway, Samuel turned away from the room and made a call. His voice dropped to little more than a whisper. "Yes, I'm certain." He listened. "No, there's no mistake. The pin is real." Another pause. "I understand." Samuel ended the call without another word and slipped the phone back into his pocket. When he turned toward the ballroom again, his face carried the calm expression of a man who had spent decades hiding surprises behind perfect customer service. Inside, no one noticed him. Every eye had settled on Evelyn Brooks. She lifted her crystal glass high enough for the chandeliers above to catch the light. "To family," she began. Polite applause answered. "To tradition," more applause. "And to sacrifice." Grace felt Daniel's fingers tighten around hers. Evelyn smiled toward Grace with the polished warmth that only made her next words sharper. "Today, my nephew begins a new chapter. Life has not always been kind to Daniel." Several guests nodded solemnly. "We all know the terrible accident changed everything." Silence drifted through the ballroom. "But life also gives unexpected blessings." She turned toward Grace. "Grace, your willingness to build a future around someone facing so many limitations speaks to a rare generosity." The sentence sounded kind, until she continued. "Many women dream of adventure, children, travel, and a husband who can dance beside them." A few guests lowered their eyes. You have chosen another path. Someone near the bar laughed softly. Evelyn pretended not to hear it. A path of patience. Another pause. A path of service. The word lingered. A path that many would not have the courage to accept. Several cousins smiled behind lifted champagne glasses. Grace understood exactly what Evelyn had done. Without speaking one openly cruel sentence, she had transformed Grace from a bride into a caregiver. Not Daniel's equal, his keeper. Across the ballroom, Preston Brooks leaned toward another cousin. She forgot to mention hospice. The men chuckled. One woman covered her smile behind a napkin. Grace looked around the room. There were nearly 100 people present. Business owners, attorneys, neighbors, family friends, country club members, servers carrying silver trays, musicians waiting for the toast to finish. Not one person interrupted. The silence itself became another guest. Daniel inhaled slowly. Grace could feel him preparing to speak. She squeezed his hand once. Not yet. Evelyn continued. We welcome Grace into our family and appreciate her compassion. Again, that tiny pause. As all of us know, compassion is sometimes the only gift life leaves to give. Applause began. Light, controlled, almost relieved. Grace slowly accepted a glass of sparkling cider from a passing server. She raised it toward Evelyn. Thank you. Her voice carried clearly across the ballroom. I've always believed compassion isn't something left over after life disappoints us. The room quieted again. I think it's something people choose long before disappointment ever arrives. No applause followed, only stillness. Grace smiled. I hope every marriage in this room is built on that same choice. For the first time all afternoon, Evelyn's practiced smile slipped. Only slightly, but enough. Daniel looked up at Grace. You always know how to answer without fighting. She leaned closer. My grandmother used to say that dignity talks quietly because it never has to prove it belongs in the room. Daniel smiled. It reached his eyes this time. Dinner was announced. Guests moved toward the long dining hall overlooking the 18th green. Round tables filled the room beneath golden lights. Each place setting gleamed with polished silverware and folded ivory napkins. Grace noticed immediately that something was wrong. Every married couple sat together. Except them. Daniel's wheelchair had been assigned to the end of one table. Grace's place card rested nearly 15 feet away, beside two distant relatives she had never met. She picked up both cards. Without asking permission, she placed hers beside Daniel's. A young event coordinator hurried over. Ma'am, I'm sorry. For what? The seating chart was approved by the family. Grace smiled gently. So is this. She slid her card beside Daniel's plate. The coordinator looked toward Evelyn across the room. Evelyn stared back, then gave the smallest shake of her head. The coordinator sighed. Enjoy your dinner. As she walked away, Grace whispered, sometimes people apologize for things they're still willing to allow. Daniel heard her. You're disappointed. No. She unfolded her napkin. Disappointment requires surprise. A waiter arrived carrying roasted salmon. He placed elegant meals before everyone around the table, then skipped Daniel entirely. Grace waited. The waiter continued walking. Excuse me, she called politely. He turned. Yes, ma'am? My husband hasn't been served. He frowned as though genuinely confused. Oh. He glanced toward another server. I thought someone else had him. Daniel looked down. Grace could almost hear every memory collecting behind his silence. Hospitals, restaurants, airports, conferences. People speaking over him, around him, past him, never to him. She smiled at the waiter. No problem, she stood. Walked calmly to the service station. Picked up Daniel's plate herself. Returned. set it gently before him. "Dinner," she said softly. The waiter shifted awkwardly. "I apologize." Daniel looked directly at him. "Thank you." No anger, no accusation. The waiter nodded once before hurrying away. Across the table, Preston laughed again. "She even serves him." Another cousin smirked. "She's already learning." Daniel finally looked at Preston. "Learning what?" "How to spend the next 40 years. The cousins laughed together. Daniel opened his mouth. Grace rested her hand over his. She answered instead, "I hope they're 40 years." The laughter faded. "Because if they are," she continued, "I'll have 40 years with a man who thanks strangers, notices waiters by name, and never mistakes arrogance for strength." She looked around the table. "I think that's a wonderful bargain." Silence. Again. Someone cleared his throat. Another guest suddenly became fascinated by the butter dish. The jazz trio quietly began another song. Preston forced a laugh. "Well, everyone's entitled to an opinion." Grace nodded. "They are." She cut Daniel's salmon into smaller pieces without embarrassment. Not because he couldn't manage, because his hands stiffened when he grew anxious. She had noticed that weeks ago. No one else had. Daniel leaned closer. "You don't have to." "I know. You'll make them think," she smiled. "I stopped worrying about what they think somewhere between the seating chart and the forgotten dinner." He laughed quietly. Across the ballroom, Samuel Price watched from near the entrance. His old eyes never left the couple. Beside him stood another elderly guest, Harold Whitmore, a retired federal judge invited by one of the Brooks cousins. Harold nodded toward Grace. "She carries herself differently," Samuel answered without looking away. "Yes, like she belongs here." Samuel finally smiled. "No." Harold looked confused. Samuel continued. "She carries herself like she belongs anywhere." Harold watched Grace help Daniel unfold his napkin before beginning her own meal. Around them, expensive conversations resumed. Investment portfolios, vacation homes, golf memberships, luxury travel. Not one topic involved the couple sitting only a few tables away. As dessert arrived, the photographer announced another round of family portraits. Guests gathered near the grand staircase. Grace began pushing Daniel toward the group. Before she reached them, Preston stepped sideways into her path. "Immediate family only." Grace looked at him calmly. "I am immediate family," he shrugged. "Depends who you ask." Nobody corrected him. Not Evelyn, not the cousins, not the attorneys laughing beside the staircase. Grace slowly looked across every face in the room. Dozens of people, watching, waiting, saying nothing. Then she gently turned Daniel's wheelchair away from the staircase. "Come on," she whispered. "Where are we going?" he asked. "Outside." "To leave?" She smiled. "No. To breathe." The evening sun had begun sinking behind the trees. Golden light stretched across the terrace. A cool breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass. Grace rolled Daniel toward a quiet stone overlook facing the lake. For several minutes, neither spoke. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. "You should have married someone easier." Grace looked at the water. "You're still saying that? You've spent one afternoon as my wife." He looked back towards their ballroom. "They've already started making you pay." Grace knelt beside his wheelchair. "So listen carefully." He met her eyes. "I didn't marry your family's approval." She placed one hand lightly over his. "I married the man who apologized to a janitor after accidentally rolling over his mop because he thought he'd been rude." Daniel blinked. "You remember that?" "I remember everything important," she smiled. "And none of today's insults made your kindness disappear." Inside the ballroom, applause suddenly erupted. Another toast had begun. Grace didn't turn around. Neither did Daniel. From the shadows beneath the terrace, Samuel Price watched them together. He quietly removed a small leather notebook from his jacket. Inside was an old business card, a single number. He looked at it, then at Daniel, then at the phoenix pin catching the last sunlight of the day. "This has gone far enough," he murmured. And somewhere far beyond the country club, another phone began to ring. Grace never heard it. The wedding guests drifted back into the ballroom, chasing dessert, champagne, and conversations that had already begun rewriting the afternoon. The string quartet had given way to a jazz trio, whose warm melodies floated through the open terrace doors. Candlelight softened the expensive room, making polished silver and crystal sparkle like stars. Out on the terrace, Grace rested her hands on the wheelchair handles without speaking. The silence between her and Daniel no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt earned. A breeze crossed the lake, stirring the loose curls around her face. "I should apologize," Daniel finally said. She looked down at him. "For what?" "For today." Grace smiled gently. "You didn't embarrass me." "My family did." They embarrassed themselves. Daniel looked toward the ballroom windows. Inside, he could still see Preston laughing with several cousins. "They've been doing that my whole life." "You mean laughing?" "No," he paused, measuring. Grace waited. "They measure everything: careers, cars, houses, schools, vacations, titles. And people?" He nodded once. "Especially people." Grace looked across the lake again. "I've lived around people like that before." Daniel glanced at her. "No, you haven't." She smiled sadly. "You'd be surprised." The fading sunlight reflected across the water, and without either of them intending it, memories quietly returned. Months earlier, every Thursday evening, the rehabilitation center on the east side of Charlotte smelled faintly of coffee, antiseptic, and fresh bread. The building wasn't beautiful. The brick walls were faded. The carpet had long ago surrendered to countless wheelchairs and walkers. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Yet every Thursday around 6 o'clock, laughter somehow found its way into the halls. Grace always arrived carrying 2 canvas grocery bags. One held donated books from the public library. The other carried homemade meals. She wasn't paid. Nobody had asked her to volunteer. She simply kept coming. "Evening, Miss Grace," a nurse named Cynthia waved from the front desk. Grace smiled. "Any birthdays today?" "Only Harold's." Grace reached into one bag. "Then somebody's getting peach cobbler." Harold Jenkins, 74, had lost his right leg after complications from diabetes. His wife had passed away years earlier, and his nieces rarely visited. When Grace wheeled the dessert into his room, Harold pretended to frown. "I told you not to spoil me." She placed the cobbler on his tray. "I'm a librarian." "So? We don't listen very well." He laughed so hard he wiped tears from his eyes. "Read to me after supper?" "I brought the next chapter." "Good." Grace spent nearly an hour reading aloud, while Harold interrupted every few pages to argue with fictional characters as though they could hear him. When she finished, she quietly collected his dishes. "Thank you," Harold whispered. "For the book?" "For remembering I exist." Grace squeezed his shoulder. "You've always existed." She left before he could see her eyes fill. Further down the hallway, another volunteer struggled to organize donated blankets. Grace immediately crossed over. "Need another pair of hands?" "I hate asking." "You didn't." Together they folded blankets until every shelf stood neatly stacked. No cameras, no praise, no speeches, just quiet work. At the far end of the therapy wing sat room 218. The door remained half open. Inside, Daniel Brooks stared through the window toward a parking lot where rain tapped softly against parked cars. He had been transferred there 6 months earlier after another round of rehabilitation. Visitors came rarely. He preferred it that way. Grace knocked softly. "Library delivery," Without turning around, he answered, "I'm not much for novels. I brought history too." Still facing the window, he said, "History reminds people what they've lost." Grace stepped inside anyway. "I thought history reminded people what survived." That answer finally made him turn. He expected pity. Instead, he found a woman balancing 3 books against one hip while trying not to drop a container of chicken soup. "You look busy," he observed. "I always look busy." "You volunteer?" She nodded. "Every Thursday." "Why?" Grace blinked. "Because Thursday exists." He almost smiled. Almost. She placed the soup beside his bed. "The cafeteria closes early. I didn't order food. I noticed. I can't pay you." "I didn't bring a bill." Daniel studied her carefully. Most visitors looked first at the wheelchair, then at his legs, then away. Grace had looked directly at his face. She seemed almost unaware of the chair. "My name's Grace." "Daniel." She extended her hand. He hesitated, finally shook it. Her grip was warm, confident. Not cautious, not sympathetic. Just normal. "Would you like something to read?" "I haven't finished thinking." "Books help with that." "They also interrupt," she laughed. "That's usually the point." He looked at the titles. History, poetry, a mystery novel. "You picked these?" "I guessed." "You guessed wrong." She picked up the poetry collection. No one guesses poetry wrong. Daniel surprised himself by smiling. The weeks passed. Every Thursday, Grace returned. Sometimes she read aloud. Sometimes she simply sat quietly while Daniel completed therapy exercises. Sometimes she helped other patients before reaching his room. One evening, she spent 40 minutes repairing the hearing aid batteries of an elderly veteran because the maintenance office had already closed. Another Thursday, she walked an anxious stroke survivor through breathing exercises before his MRI appointment. Daniel watched all of it. She never hurried, never announced her kindness, never expected gratitude. One rainy evening, he finally asked the question that had been growing inside him. "Why are you here?" Grace looked up from shelving returned books. "I already answered that." "No." He shook his head. "Why really?" She considered it. "When I was growing up, my mother worked double shifts." He listened quietly. "There were days neighbors made sure we had dinner." She smiled faintly. "They didn't save my life." She looked around the rehabilitation center. "They just made sure loneliness didn't win." Daniel lowered his eyes. "You think loneliness can win?" "I've seen it." He looked toward this hallway. "So have I." For several minutes, neither spoke. Then Daniel asked something unexpected. "Grace." "If somebody offered you a perfect husband," she laughed. "That's an unusual sentence. Would you choose him?" Grace closed the book in her lap. "I don't believe perfect people exist." "What if they did?" She smiled. "I'd probably choose someone kind instead." Daniel looked away. "You deserve somebody whole." Grace answered immediately. "I've never met anyone whole." He frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means every person carries something broken." She looked directly into his eyes. "The question is whether they let it make them cruel." Daniel didn't answer. Not because he disagreed, because no one had ever described him without mentioning the wheelchair first. That night, after Grace left, he stared at the ceiling for hours. He thought about introducing himself properly, about telling her everything, about explaining who he had been before the accident. Every time he imagined the conversation, one fear swallowed all the others. What if the moment she learned his name, she stopped seeing him? Back at the country club, Grace looked toward the ballroom where laughter echoed through expensive glass. "You've gone quiet," she said. Daniel smiled faintly. "I was remembering the first bowl of soup. You almost refused it." I almost refused you. She laughed softly. I'm persistent. I noticed. She bent slightly to straighten the blanket across his knees. I noticed something too. What? You've apologized 5 times today. He sighed. I'm keeping count. She rested one hand gently on his shoulder. I don't need apologies. What do you need? Grace looked at him with complete honesty. The same man who sat in room 218. Daniel held her gaze. For a long moment, neither spoke. Inside the ballroom, another toast began. Neither moved toward it. Across the parking lot, Samuel Price quietly climbed into his aging sedan. He started the engine but didn't drive away. Instead, he looked once more toward the country club. The chairman won't be hidden much longer, he whispered. Then he pulled onto the darkening road as another call connected through his car's speaker. Yes, Samuel said. I found him. And somewhere inside Brooks Quantum Systems headquarters, a boardroom that had waited months for impossible news suddenly fell completely silent. The voice on the speaker belonged to Samuel Price. Around the polished black table, 12 executives stared at one another beneath the blue-white glow of recessed lights. Beyond the glass walls, Charlotte glittered 30 floors below, a grid of traffic and office towers fading into the dark. At the head of the table sat a woman named Rebecca Sloan, 56, Chief Legal Officer of Brooks Quantum Systems. She had spent 9 months speaking to Daniel through encrypted calls, receiving his signed directives through private channels, and assuring nervous investors that the company's absent chairman remained fully engaged. She had never asked where he was. That had been Daniel's condition. Now her hand tightened around a silver pen. Say that again. Samuel's voice crackled through the speaker. I found Mr. Brooks at a wedding outside Charlotte. Several executives leaned forward. Rebecca closed her eyes briefly. Was he alone? No. Is he safe? Samuel looked through his windshield at the country club shrinking in his rearview mirror. He is married. The silence in the boardroom changed. A younger executive whispered, Married? Rebecca ignored him. To whom? A woman named Grace Mitchell. Samuel paused. And before anyone sends flowers, lawyers, or a motorcade, you need to understand something. Rebecca's expression hardened. What happened? They mocked them. No one moved. Samuel continued. They pushed his chair away from the center of the ceremony for the photographs. They separated his wife from the family. They made jokes about her spending her life serving him. Rebecca slowly set down the pen. And Mr. Brooks? He stayed calm. Mrs. Brooks? Samuel's voice softened. She stayed calmer. Back at the country club, Grace and Daniel returned to the ballroom for the final hour of the reception. Most of the guests were dancing now. Music rolled beneath the chandeliers. Glasses clinked. Servers cleared plates while the room slowly relaxed into the false peace that follows public cruelty when everyone agrees to pretend nothing happened. Grace did not pretend. She simply chose not to let it own the rest of her night. She pushed Daniel toward the edge of the dance floor. A middle-aged couple turned away as they approached. Another guest lifted a phone, pretending to take a photograph of the decorations while clearly aiming at them. Daniel noticed. Want to leave? Grace looked at the dancers. No. You've had enough. I've had enough of them deciding what I get to enjoy. The band began a slow standard. Grace stepped in front of Daniel and placed his hands around her waist. His eyebrows rose. What are you doing? Dancing. I don't dance. You're married now. The rules changed. She moved carefully, swaying between the arms of his chair while he held her. At first, he remained stiff. Then the tension left his shoulders. Grace closed her eyes. For one song, the laughter, whispers, photographs, and careful insults disappeared. A few guests watched. One elderly woman smiled. Most simply stared. When the music ended, Daniel whispered, "Thank you." For what? For not letting them take everything. Grace touched his cheek. They can only take what we hand them. The reception ended shortly after sunset. A hired car took them from the country club to a modest rental house in West Charlotte, where Grace had lived before their courthouse marriage. It stood on a narrow street lined with old maples, duplexes, and porch lights glowing against the humid night. Daniel had offered to rent something larger. Grace had refused. "This house knows me," she had said. He never told her he owned properties on 4 continents. That night, after Grace fell asleep, Daniel sat alone near the bedroom window. His phone rested on that table beside him. 3 missed calls, all from Rebecca Sloan. He deleted the notifications. Across the room, Grace slept with one hand beneath her cheek, still wearing the simple gold band he had chosen at a neighborhood jewelry store. Daniel watched her for a long time. Then he turned the phone face down. By Monday afternoon, the Brooks family had arranged what Evelyn called a private conversation. The invitation arrived through Daniel's cousin Preston. No details, only an address. A financial club occupying the top floor of a restored bank building in uptown Charlotte. Grace arrived after her shift at the library, wearing a navy dress, low heels, and the same canvas tote she carried to work. Daniel came beside her in his wheelchair, his silver phoenix pin absent from his jacket. Inside, marble floors reflected warm brass lights. Oil paintings of bankers, judges, and railroad owners lined the walls. A hostess led them to a private lounge. Evelyn waited inside. So did Preston, Uncle Warren Brooks, and 2 attorneys. One attorney was a thin man with rimless glasses named Miles Parker. The other, Cynthia Wells, sat with a leather folder open in front of her. Grace stopped just inside the doorway. "This looks less like a conversation and more like an ambush." Warren smiled. "Please sit." "I'm comfortable standing." Daniel rolled closer. "What is this?" Miles Parker cleared his throat. "A standard family protection agreement." Grace looked at the folder. "We're already married." "Yes," Cynthia answered. "That is why the document is postnuptial." Grace sat slowly. Evelyn folded her hands. "This is not personal." Grace almost smiled. "People usually say that right before making something deeply personal." Preston leaned back in his chair. "No one is accusing you of anything." "Then this should be quick." Miles slid the papers toward her. The first page required Grace to waive any claim to Brooks family trusts. The second limited her access to Daniel's medical decisions. The third stated that if she left the marriage within 5 years, she would receive nothing. The fourth gave Evelyn and Warren authority to approve major financial decisions involving Daniel. Grace read every line. No one spoke while she turned the pages. Daniel watched her face. She showed no anger. That frightened him more than anger would have. When she finished, she placed the papers neatly on the table. "This agreement protects everyone except my husband." Warren's smile disappeared. "It protects Daniel from being exploited. By his wife? By circumstances." Grace looked directly at him. "What circumstances?" Warren exhaled, as though explaining something obvious. "You met him in rehabilitation. He has limited income, limited mobility, a complicated medical future." Daniel's hands tightened around the wheels of his chair. Warren continued. "People in vulnerable conditions make emotional decisions." Grace's voice remained calm. "You mean marrying me?" Evelyn intervened. "Grace, we are trying to prevent future pain." "Whose?" No one answered. She looked down at the papers again. "You want control over his finances, his care, and his marriage." "That is an unfair interpretation," Cynthia said. "It is written in plain English." Preston leaned forward. "Let's stop pretending this is complicated." Daniel turned toward him. "Careful." Preston ignored the warning. "You were working at a public library when you met him. You live in a neighborhood most people here avoid after dark. Daniel offered you security." Grace looked at him. Did he? Preston hesitated. Grace continued. I still work at the library. I still live in the same house. So tell me what security you think I married. Warren opened a second folder. This. He placed a check on the table. Grace looked at the number. $250,000. The room went very still. Warren's voice softened. Walk away quietly within 6 months, and the money is yours. Daniel moved so quickly his chair struck the edge of the table. The sound cracked through the lounge. Take it back! Warren did not look at him. Daniel, this is for everyone's benefit. You offered my wife money to leave me. We offered her an option. Grace picked up the check. For one hopeful second, Preston smiled. Then she tore it cleanly in half. The sound was small, almost gentle. She placed both pieces in front of Warren. I had less than $40 in my checking account the night Daniel asked if I was sure about marrying him. She folded her hands. I was sure then. Her eyes moved around the table. I am sure now. No one spoke. Not the attorneys, not Evelyn, not Preston. The same silence from the wedding returned, colder this time. Grace stood. You keep calling him vulnerable because he uses a wheelchair. She looked at Daniel. The weakest person in this room is not my husband. Warren's face darkened. Think carefully before you walk out. Grace lifted her tote. I already did. She stepped toward the door. Daniel remained behind for 1 second. He looked at his relatives with an expression none of them recognized. It was not hurt. It was calculation. Then he followed Grace. In the hallway, she stopped near the elevators. Daniel came beside her. I'm sorry. She pressed the elevator button. You didn't write those papers. I knew they might try something. Grace turned. You knew? He looked down. I know how they think. And you let me walk into that room without warning. I wanted to see what they would do. The elevator arrived with a soft chime. Grace did not enter. Her disappointment landed more heavily than any accusation. Daniel, I am your wife. I know. No. She shook her head. You know how to say the word. I'm not sure you know what it requires. The doors began to close. Grace stepped inside. Daniel blocked them with one hand and rolled in after her. Neither spoke during the descent. Behind them, inside the private lounge, Cynthia Wells collected the torn check. Preston moved toward the window. That woman is dangerous. Evelyn looked at him. She refused $250,000. Exactly. Uncle Warren poured himself a drink. We need to know what she really wants. Near the half-closed lounge door, a junior employee named Natalie Cole lowered her phone. She had photographed every page of the agreement. She had also captured the check, and Grace tearing it in half. Natalie looked down at the images. Then she opened a secure email address she had been given months earlier by Brooks Quantum Systems' legal department. Subject line, Urgent. Daniel Brooks, Family Matter. She attached the photographs. Across the city, Rebecca Sloan's computer chimed. She opened the message, read the first page, then the second. By the time she reached the photograph of the torn check, her expression had gone hard. She picked up her phone. Prepare the ethics file on Warren Brooks and every family trust he controls. Her assistant hesitated. Should we notify the chairman? Rebecca looked at the silver phoenix emblem mounted on the wall behind her desk. No. She closed the post-nuptial agreement. Not yet. Outside the bank building, rain had begun falling over Charlotte. Grace stood beneath the awning while Daniel waited beside her. Cars hissed across the wet street. Neon reflected red and gold across the pavement. Finally, Daniel said, You should be angry. Grace looked into the rain. I am. You don't sound angry. My mother used to say anger is expensive. I don't spend it until I know what I'm buying. Daniel stared at her. What are you buying now? Grace turned toward him. The truth. He felt the words strike somewhere deep. She held his gaze. And sooner or later, Daniel, you are going to give it to me. Across town, Rebecca Sloan opened a locked drawer and removed a file bearing the silver phoenix. For the first time in months, the chairman's hidden life and his public empire had begun moving toward the same room. Grace knew nothing about the file. The next morning, she woke before sunrise to the steady ticking of rain against the bedroom window. The small rental house was dark except for the yellow light above the stove. Water moved through the gutters outside. Tires whispered along the wet street. Somewhere beyond the neighborhood, a city bus groaned to a stop and pulled away again. Daniel sat at the kitchen table with the cup of coffee untouched between his hands. Grace entered wearing a gray cardigan over her library blouse. "You're up early," she said. "I didn't sleep." She opened the refrigerator. Neither did the rain. He watched her place bread in the toaster and wrap 2 sandwiches in wax paper. "You're still going to work?" "Yes." "After yesterday?" "The books didn't insult me." He almost smiled. Grace placed 1 sandwich in her canvas tote and slid the other across the table toward him. Daniel looked down at it. "You're not going to ask me anything?" "I already did." "The truth?" "Yes." "And if I'm not ready?" Grace closed the refrigerator door. "Then I go to work." There was no cruelty in her voice. That made it harder. Daniel looked at her as if he wanted to say something large enough to change the room, but fear held it behind his teeth. Grace walked over and straightened the collar of his shirt. "You don't have to tell me everything this morning." His eyes lifted. "But you do have to stop letting silence make decisions for us." Then she picked up her coat and left. The rain had softened by the time Grace reached the West Boulevard branch library. The building sat between a laundromat and a discount grocery store. Its brick walls were faded. One of the front windows had been repaired with a narrow strip of clear tape after a storm. The heating system complained every winter, and the air conditioner rarely survived July without a service call. Grace loved it completely. Inside, warm light rested across rows of worn tables and crowded shelves. The building smelled of paper, dust, and coffee from the staff room. Her supervisor, Linda Carver, met her behind the circulation desk. Linda was 59, white-haired, and direct in the way of someone who had spent 30 years telling people their library fines were not a personal attack. "You look tired." "I attended a family meeting." "That bad?" There were attorneys. Linda winced. "Worse than Thanksgiving." Grace smiled. Before she could say more, a man named Thomas Bell approached the desk carrying a folder of medical forms. Thomas was 68, a retired warehouse worker with severe arthritis in both hands. He had been trying for weeks to complete an application for transportation assistance. "Miss Grace," he said quietly, "I hate to bother you again." "You're not bothering me. My handwriting doesn't look right in these boxes." Grace glanced toward the line forming at the desk, then at the forms. "Sit at the corner table. I'll meet you there in 10 minutes. "You sure?" "I already promised you last week." Thomas nodded with visible relief. For the next hour, Grace moved between patrons. She helped a 34-year-old nursing assistant create a resume after a layoff. She printed a bus schedule for an elderly woman whose eyesight had begun failing. She showed a 51-year-old man how to use the library's computer to contact his brother in another state. None of it was dramatic. No music rose. No one applauded. Grace simply noticed what people needed and did what she could. At noon, she sat beside Thomas Bell and filled out his transportation forms exactly as he dictated. When they finished, he reached into his coat and placed a folded $20 bill on the table. Grace pushed it back. "For your time." "My time belongs to the library until 5. "This is personal." "So is rent. Keep it." Thomas frowned. You're always helping somebody. So are you. He laughed softly. I can barely open a jar. You fixed loading equipment for 36 years. Half the businesses in this neighborhood used machines you kept running. That was work? Grace handed him the completed forms. Work counts. Thomas stared at her for a long moment. Your husband is lucky. Grace thought about Daniel sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by truths he could not yet speak. We're both learning what luck means. That evening, Grace left the library carrying 2 bags of donated canned food. The rain had returned, harder now, hammering the awnings and sending silver rivers along the curbs. She crossed 3 blocks to the community kitchen at St. Matthew's Hall. The kitchen operated from the basement of an old church, though no one was required to attend services or answer questions about faith. Steam fogged the windows. Pots clanged against steel counters. The air smelled of onions, tomato broth, and fresh cornbread. Grace tied an apron over her dress. A volunteer named Carl Benton, 46, pointed toward the back. We're short 1 pair of hands. Then you have mine. For 2 hours she served stew to adults who worked nights, adults between homes, elderly tenants choosing between food and medicine, and veterans who disliked asking anyone for anything. Grace greeted each person by name when she knew it. When she did not, she asked. Near closing time, an older woman named Renee Wallace stood by the doorway counting coins in her palm. Renee was 73 and lived alone in a building where the elevator had been broken for months. Grace approached. You need bus fare? I'm fine. You're holding 90 cents and the bus is $2. Renee gave her a suspicious look. You counting my money now? I'm a librarian. We're dangerous with numbers. Renee snorted. Grace handed her a transit pass from her wallet. Take this. You need it. I walk. In this rain? I own an umbrella. Renee looked at the umbrella leaning beside the coat rack. One metal rib had broken through the fabric. That thing looks tired. It has character. Renee accepted the pass. You won't take anything? Tomorrow, call the housing office about that elevator. They don't listen. Tell them Grace Mitchell from the library will call after you. Renee smiled. That a threat? A promise. By the time Grace stepped outside, the city had gone dark. Neon from a pawnshop sign bled red across the wet sidewalk. Buses hissed at the corner. Wind carried cold rain beneath her umbrella. She started toward the transit station. Across town, Daniel sat in the back of an unmarked black sedan. He had told Grace he needed fresh air. In truth, he had asked his longtime driver, Marcus Hill, 52, to take him near the community kitchen without announcing himself. Marcus parked half a block away. You planning to go inside? He asked. No. You planning to tell your wife why a man with a disability check has a driver who used to transport cabinet officials? Daniel looked through the rain-streaked window. Not tonight. Marcus shook his head. You're playing with the good woman's trust. I know. That knowledge has not improved your behavior. Daniel did not answer. Then he saw Grace at the bus station. She was kneeling beneath the shelter, beside a man lying against the bench. Daniel leaned forward. What happened? Marcus looked. The man was older, perhaps 65, wearing a faded military field jacket. One sleeve was torn at the shoulder. Blood darkened the fabric near his forehead. Though the injury appeared minor, a grocery cart holding blankets and a sealed plastic bag stood nearby. Several commuters kept their distance. A bus pulled in. Doors opened. People stepped around the injured man and boarded. Grace remained. She placed her tote beneath his head and pressed a clean handkerchief against the cut. Sir, can you hear me? The man blinked. Don't call the police. I'm calling an ambulance. No hospitals. You hit your head. I slipped. And now you're confused. I'm not confused. What's your name? He hesitated. Raymond Carter. Mr. Carter, I'm Grace. I don't need charity. Good, I didn't bring any. He looked at her. Rain rattled against the shelter roof. Grace removed her cardigan and folded it across his shoulders. A woman waiting near the schedule board lifted her phone. At first, Daniel assumed she was calling emergency services. Then he realized she was recording. Grace did not notice. She was too busy keeping Raymond awake. "Tell me where you served," she said. His eyes narrowed. "How do you know?" "The jacket. 22 years, Army logistics." "What did you move?" "Everything people needed before they knew they needed it." Grace smiled. "Then you understand why I'm staying until help arrives." The ambulance siren grew louder. Raymond's eyes filled with fear. "They'll take my cart." Grace stood and caught the attention of the driver. "I'll make sure it follows you." "You can't promise that." "I just did." 2 emergency medical technicians stepped into the shelter. Grace explained what had happened, gave Raymond's name, and insisted his belongings be secured in the ambulance. One technician nodded. "We'll take care of it." Grace climbed halfway inside to place the grocery cart carefully against the wall. Raymond caught her wrist. "Why?" She looked at him. "Because everybody walked past." The words were simple. They struck Daniel harder than the rain. The ambulance pulled away. Grace remained beneath the shelter, soaked through, holding the broken umbrella and her empty tote. The woman with the phone approached. "That was kind." Grace looked embarrassed. "He needed help. I recorded some of it." Grace's expression changed. "Please delete it." "Why?" "Because his worst moment isn't entertainment." The woman lowered the phone. "I wasn't trying to embarrass him." "I know," Grace softened. "But kindness doesn't need an audience." She walked away before the woman could respond. Inside the sedan, Marcus looked at Daniel. She gave away her sweater. Daniel kept watching Grace disappear through the rain. She always gives away what she needs. Marcus glanced at him. "And you keep hiding what she deserves to know." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Drive home." The woman at the bus station did not delete the video. Her name was Natalie Cole. She was the same junior employee who had photographed the family meeting. She had followed Grace on Rebecca Sloan's instructions, expecting to uncover manipulation, greed, or some hidden connection to the Brooks fortune. Instead, she had watched Grace spend an entire evening helping people who had nothing to offer her. Natalie sat beneath the shelter after everyone left. She replayed the recording. Grace kneeling in the rain. Grace refusing money. Grace protecting an injured man's dignity even when no one was watching. Natalie opened a secure message to Rebecca Sloan. She attached the video. Her note contained only one sentence. "I think we have been investigating the wrong person." At Brooks Quantum Systems, Rebecca watched the footage twice. Then she called a meeting for 7 the next morning. Back at the rental house, Grace entered quietly and hung the broken umbrella beside the door. Daniel was waiting in the kitchen. His eyes moved to her wet dress. "Where's your cardigan?" "Someone needed it." "Who?" "A man at the bus station." "Was he hurt?" "He'll be all right." Daniel stared at her. "You say that as if it costs nothing." Grace removed her shoes. "What?" "Giving people pieces of yourself." She looked at him with tired eyes. "Pieces grow back." Daniel's voice broke slightly. "Not always." Grace crossed the room and knelt beside him. "No." She placed one hand over his. "But sometimes the part that grows back is stronger." For one dangerous second, Daniel nearly told her everything. The company, the money, the hidden calls, the executive files, the life built behind the chair. Then his phone vibrated on the table. A message appeared from Rebecca Sloan. "The board has seen the video. We need you in person." Grace saw only the first line before Daniel turned the phone face down. Her eyes lifted to his. "Who is Rebecca?" Daniel said nothing. Outside, rainwater streamed beneath the streetlights, and in the silence between them, the truth moved one step closer to the door. Grace remained beside Daniel's wheelchair, one hand resting lightly over his. "Who is Rebecca?" she asked again. Daniel looked toward the darkened window. "A lawyer. For your family? In a way. That is not an answer." He rubbed his thumb against the edge of the table. "She handles complicated matters." Grace waited. Rain tapped the glass. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere in the next apartment, an old television played softly through the wall. Daniel had spent years negotiating mergers, lawsuits, and contracts worth more than entire neighborhoods. Yet under Grace's steady gaze, he could not arrange a simple sentence. "She helped me after the accident," he finally said. "With what?" "My affairs." "What affairs?" He looked at her. The trust in her face had not disappeared. That made the lie harder to hold, and the truth harder to release. "Daniel, she is someone I depend on." Grace stood slowly. "I understand depending on people." She lifted her wet tote from the floor. "What I do not understand is why every answer you give me creates another locked room." He reached for her hand, but she moved toward the hallway. Grace. I'm tired. I'm trying to protect what we have." She stopped beneath the yellow hallway light. From whom? He had no answer that would not reveal everything. Grace nodded once, sadly. "That is what I thought." She went into the bedroom and closed the door without slamming it. Daniel sat alone in the kitchen. His phone vibrated again. Rebecca Sloan calling. This time he answered. "What did you show the board?" Rebecca did not waste time. "The agreement your relatives tried to force on Grace, the check, the bus station video." "You had her followed?" "I had a potential threat assessed." "She is my wife, not a threat." "We did not know that." "You know now." Rebecca's voice softened slightly. "Yes, we know now." Daniel looked toward the closed bedroom door. "She asked who you are." "Then tell her. It is not that simple. It became simple when you married her." Daniel said nothing. Rebecca continued. "Samuel Price recognized the founder's PIN. He contacted the old emergency line. I told him never to use it. He watched your family humiliate you and Grace in front of a room full of people. That was not his decision to make. Neither was disappearing for almost a year while Warren Brooks used your absence to move company contracts through relatives." Daniel's expression changed. "What contracts?" Rebecca paused. "That was enough. Send me everything." "We are still verifying." "Send it." "Daniel, the board needs you in person." "No." "The company is preparing for the annual Brooks Foundation Gala. Investors are already asking why the chairman has not appeared publicly since the accident. I have led every meeting. Through encrypted audio, no camera, no physical appearances. My signature still controls the company. For now." Daniel's jaw tightened. Rebecca spoke more carefully. "Warren and Preston have been telling people that your condition has affected your judgment. They are building support for a competency review." Daniel glanced toward the hallway. "And Grace? They intend to use her against you." The words chilled the room. "How?" "They will argue she manipulated a vulnerable man into marriage." Daniel closed his eyes. The post-nuptial agreement had not been about protecting him. It had been evidence. A record they could later hold up as proof that Grace had refused reasonable safeguards. "They planned that room," he said. "Yes." "The attorneys?" "Connected to family trusts Warren controls." Daniel's voice went cold. "Freeze every Brooks family disbursement tied to company funds. I need your written authorization. You will have it before sunrise." "And the gala?" "No. Daniel, I am not walking into a ballroom to prove I am still capable. Rebecca exhaled. Then do it for Grace. He ended the call. The next morning, Charlotte woke beneath low gray clouds. Grace left for the library before Daniel came into the kitchen. On the table, she had placed his coffee in a covered mug and left no note. Daniel stared at the mug for a long time. By 9 o'clock, a black SUV waited outside the rental house. Marcus Hill opened the rear door. "You look terrible," he said. "I did not call you for encouragement." "No. You called me because the chairman of Brooks Quantum Systems cannot order a regular rideshare without creating 3 security alerts." Daniel rolled up the portable ramp. Inside the vehicle, 2 secure tablets rested on the seat. Marcus pulled away from the curb. Rebecca sent the files. Daniel opened the first. Contracts awarded to shell vendors, consulting payments to relatives, equipment purchases routed through a company controlled by Preston, travel reimbursements for events that never occurred. At the bottom of several approvals appeared Daniel's electronic signature. Except Daniel had never approved them. "They copied the authentication key," he said. Marcus looked at him through the mirror. "From where?" "Only 4 people had access." "Rebecca?" "No." Daniel scrolled farther. "Warren, Preston, the former finance chief, and me." Marcus shook his head. "You disappear, and your family turns your company into a feeding trough." Daniel closed the file. "They did not wait for me to disappear." The SUV entered uptown Charlotte, passing glass towers and construction cranes. Rainwater shone on the streets. Workers hurried beneath umbrellas. The headquarters of Brooks Quantum Systems rose ahead, 42 stories of dark steel and blue glass. Daniel did not enter through the main lobby. The SUV descended into a private underground garage. Rebecca waited beside a secure elevator. She wore a charcoal suit and carried a leather portfolio. When Daniel rolled out, she studied him. "You kept the pin." He touched the empty place on his lapel. "No." Rebecca frowned. "It is at home." "With Grace?" "She polished it for the wedding." For the first time that morning, Rebecca smiled. Samuel was right about her. Daniel's expression remained guarded. "You had no right to test her." "No, but your family did, and she passed a test she should never have been forced to take." They entered the elevator. No floor buttons were visible. Rebecca placed her palm against a dark sensor. The doors closed. As the elevator climbed, she said, "The board wants to meet." "They can wait." They have waited 11 months. So has Grace. The doors opened into a private executive floor. The hallway was silent, carpeted, and lined with abstract paintings. At the far end stood a pair of glass doors bearing a silver phoenix. Daniel stopped. For a moment, he was not a hidden chairman. He was a man returning to a place where everyone knew what he had once been. Rebecca waited beside him. "No cameras," she said. "No press?" "None." He rolled forward. Inside the boardroom, 12 executives rose at once. No applause, no performance, only respect. "Mr. Chairman," they said. Daniel looked around the table. Some faces held relief, others guilt. One man looked frightened. Daniel noticed them all. "Sit." The executives obeyed. Rebecca placed the corruption files before him. Daniel did not open them. "My family publicly humiliated my wife," he said. "Then they attempted to purchase the end of my marriage." No one moved. They believed she was poor. They believed I was powerless. They believed no one important was watching. His eyes traveled around the room. That belief is the first item on today's agenda. Across town, Grace shelved returned books in the library's history section. Her phone rang inside her cardigan pocket. Unknown number. She nearly ignored it. "Grace Mitchell speaking. Mrs. Brooks?" The voice was elderly and careful. "Yes?" "My name is Samuel Price. I was the concierge at your wedding. Grace remembered the green jacket, the rattling champagne glasses, the way he had stared at Daniel's pin. I remember you. I owe you an apology. For what? For remaining silent. Grace leaned against the bookshelf. Samuel continued. I watched what happened in that ballroom. I told myself I was an employee, and it was not my place. His voice carried genuine shame. But silence always chooses a side, whether we admit it or not. Grace looked down the empty aisle. Why did you call me? Because I recognized the pin on your husband's jacket. Her breathing changed. What is it? Samuel hesitated. It belongs to a man I met 20 years ago. Daniel! Not exactly. Grace gripped the phone. Samuel spoke slowly. The Phoenix was the private insignia of a company founder who built something extraordinary and then vanished from public life after a terrible accident. Grace closed her eyes. Which company? Before Samuel could answer, Linda called from the circulation desk. Grace, there are people here asking for you. Grace looked toward the front windows. 3 black sedans had stopped outside the library. Men and women in dark suits stepped onto the wet sidewalk. One of them was Rebecca Sloan. Samuel's voice came through the phone. Mrs. Brooks, whatever happens next, remember this. Grace watched Rebecca enter the library. The pin was never valuable because it was silver. Rebecca removed her gloves and approached. It was valuable because of the man who wore it. Grace lowered the phone. Rebecca stopped a few feet away. Mrs. Brooks, my name is Rebecca Sloan. I serve as Chief Legal Officer of Brooks Quantum Systems. The library had gone unusually quiet. Patrons looked up from computers. Linda stood behind the desk. Grace held Rebecca's gaze. What does that have to do with my husband? Rebecca glanced around the room. This is not the place to discuss it. Grace's expression hardened. Then you should not have brought 3 cars. Rebecca accepted the rebuke. You are right. She lowered her voice. Daniel is in danger of losing control of something he built. His relatives intend to use your marriage to do it. Grace felt the floor shift beneath her, though she remained perfectly still. What did he build? Rebecca looked toward the old Phoenix pin now fastened to Grace's canvas tote. She had placed it there that morning after finding it on Daniel's dresser. The silver wings caught the library's warm light. Ask him tonight, Rebecca said. Ask him why that symbol appears above the boardroom of a company worth more than $12 billion. Grace stared at her. Outside, another sedan pulled to the curb. Inside it sat Warren Brooks. He watched Rebecca speaking to Grace through the library window. Then he lifted his phone. Preston, he said. They found her first. A pause. No more jokes, no more family pressure. His eyes narrowed. If Daniel brings that woman into the company, we lose everything. Across the city, Daniel placed his hand on the corruption file and addressed the board. The annual gala proceeds as scheduled. Rebecca's empty chair remained at his right. One executive asked, Will you attend? Daniel thought of Grace kneeling beside an injured stranger in the rain. He thought of the torn check. He thought of the wedding guests who had laughed because they believed a wheelchair had erased the man inside it. Yes, he said. The boardroom fell silent. Daniel looked toward the silver phoenix mounted on the wall. And this time, my wife enters beside me. 3 nights later, the Brooks Foundation Gala transformed the Grand Meridian Hotel in uptown Charlotte into a palace of glass and gold. Black cars lined the curb beneath a canopy of white lights. Valets opened doors for senators, investors, hospital directors, university presidents, and executives whose names appeared regularly in financial magazines. Inside, a string ensemble played beneath a ceiling painted with clouds, while servers moved through the ballroom, carrying trays of champagne and tiny silver spoons of caviar. Grace stood in the hotel's private dressing room, staring at herself in a mirror framed by warm bulbs. Rebecca Sloan had sent the dress. Grace had nearly refused it. The gown was deep blue, simple through the shoulders, fitted at the waist, and without a single crystal or designer emblem visible from the outside. It was elegant in this quiet way Grace preferred. Her own shoes sat beneath the chair. So did her canvas library tote. She had brought both despite Rebecca's suggestion that the hotel could provide anything she needed. Grace touched the silver phoenix pin now fastened near her collarbone. Daniel had not asked her to wear it. She had chosen to. A knock came at the door. "Come in." Daniel entered in a black tuxedo, moving his wheelchair with one hand. The other rested against the armrest. For a moment, he simply looked at her. Grace noticed the tiredness beneath his eyes. "You were going to tell me tonight," she said. He did not pretend not to understand. "Yes. Before Rebecca came to my library? I didn't know she was going there, but you knew the truth was coming." Daniel rolled farther into the room. "I knew I couldn't keep it hidden." Grace turned away from the mirror. "Then why did you?" His gaze dropped briefly to the phoenix pin. "Because this was the first thing you saw me wearing that belonged to that life." Grace touched the pin. "What life?" He inhaled slowly. "The one behind the doors I kept closing." Music drifted through the wall. Somewhere below, applause rose as another important guest entered the ballroom. Grace waited. Daniel's hands settled in his lap. "I built a company with 2 engineers in the rented warehouse outside Raleigh. We designed secure medical communication systems for hospitals that couldn't afford the larger networks." Grace said nothing. "The company grew." "How much?" He looked at her. "More than I expected." "That is not a number. Brooks Quantum Systems is valued at a little over $12 billion. Grace's face remained still. Only her fingers moved, releasing the pin. Daniel continued before courage failed him. "I am the founder, chairman, and controlling shareholder." The sounds of the hotel seemed to recede. Grace looked at the man before her. The modest rental house, the disability check he never quite explained, the old shirts, the unanswered calls, the attorneys, the black cars, Rebecca, the boardroom symbol. All of it rearranged itself at once. "You are the chairman." "Yes." "The chairman they were searching for." "Yes." "The man your relatives were afraid I might influence." "Yes." Grace turned back toward the mirror. In the reflection, Daniel looked smaller than he had at the country club, though nothing about him had changed. She spoke carefully. "Did you marry me because you loved me?" "Yes." "Did you hide this because you believed I would want your money?" His silence answered before he did. Grace closed her eyes. Daniel rolled closer. "I believed the money would enter the room before I had the chance to." "You already entered the room." Her voice remained low. "You entered my home, my work, my life." "I know." "No, Daniel. You entered all of it while deciding which parts of your own life I was allowed to see." "I was afraid." "So was I." She turned. "I was afraid when your family laughed at me. I was afraid when attorneys placed a check in front of me. I was afraid when people followed me through the rain." His face changed. "You knew? I know what it feels like when someone watches without helping." Grace picked up her tote. "You let me defend you as a man with nothing. I never asked you to." "No." Her eyes filled, but her voice did not break. "You only watched." A knock came at the door. Rebecca's voice followed. "Mr. Brooks, Mrs. Brooks, the board has arrived." Grace looked toward Daniel. "The board?" He nodded. "They are here to meet you. To meet us." That was the plan. Grace gave a small, wounded laugh. Of course there was a plan. She opened the door. Rebecca stood outside with Samuel Price. The elderly concierge wore a black suit instead of his green hotel jacket. His posture was straight, but his expression carried regret. "Mrs. Brooks," he said. Grace looked at him. "You made the call." "Yes." "Why?" "Because I recognized the pin." He looked toward Daniel. 20 years ago, I worked overnight security at the first Brooks Quantum warehouse. Mr. Brooks was 28 then. He arrived before sunrise and left after midnight. Samuel smiled faintly. He remembered every janitor's name. Grace glanced at Daniel. Samuel continued. "When my wife became ill, the company paid for her treatment without putting its name on anything. Mr. Brooks told me dignity disappears when kindness becomes advertising." The words struck Grace because they sounded like something she herself might have said. Samuel looked down. "At your wedding, I watched people treat both of you as though worth could be measured by a chair, a dress, or an address." His voice weakened. "And I stayed silent too long." Grace studied him. "You called because of Daniel's company." "I called because of what the company was supposed to stand for." Rebecca stepped forward. "The ballroom is ready." Grace looked at Daniel. He did not ask her to forgive him. He did not reach for her. "Will you still come in beside me?" he asked. She looked toward the distant elevator. "I will enter beside you." Hope flickered across his face. Grace finished. "That is not the same as saying I am staying." The elevator doors opened onto the ballroom level. The sound reached them first. Hundreds of voices beneath chandeliers, silverware against china, the soft roar of wealth gathered in one room. Grace placed both hands on Daniel's wheelchair, not because he needed her to push, because she had entered this night as his wife, and she would not allow the truth to make her perform shame. The ballroom doors opened. Conversation dimmed. At first, guests noticed Grace. Then Daniel. Whispers spread. "That's Warren's nephew." "The one from the wedding? He actually came?" "Who invited the librarian?" Preston Brooks stood beside a group of investors near the stage, his face drained of color. Warren moved toward Evelyn. "This was not on the program." Evelyn stared at the phoenix pin on Grace's dress. "It cannot be." Grace and Daniel crossed the ballroom slowly. Some guests recognized them from the country club wedding. Several were the same people who had laughed. The same people who had watched Grace serve Daniel's forgotten meal. The same people who had remained silent while she was excluded from photographs. Their eyes followed the wheelchair. No one greeted them. Then the ballroom doors opened again. Rebecca Sloan entered with the 12 senior executives of Brooks Quantum Systems. The executives walked in two measured lines. The crowd parted. Warren stepped forward with a strained smile. "Rebecca, what is the meaning of—" She passed him without answering. Every executive stopped before Daniel. The orchestra fell silent. A photographer lowered his camera. Rebecca inclined her head. "Good evening, Mr. Chairman." The 12 executives followed. "Good evening, Mr. Chairman." The words rolled through the ballroom. No one moved. Grace felt the wheelchair handles beneath her palms. Daniel lifted his head. "Good evening." Preston's champagne glass slipped from his fingers and struck the carpet without breaking. Warren stared as if the room had tilted. Someone near the stage whispered, "Chairman of what?" Rebecca turned toward the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, before tonight's program begins, it is my honor to welcome the founder, controlling shareholder, and active chairman of Brooks Quantum Systems." The company's silver phoenix illuminated the giant screen behind the stage. The same symbol Grace wore, the same symbol everyone had ignored. Daniel moved forward under his own power now. Leaving Grace's hands empty, he rolled to the center of the room. Camera shutters began clicking. The audience rose unevenly. Some in shock, some in fear, some because everyone else was standing. Daniel looked toward his relatives. "Please sit." The room obeyed. Grace remained standing. Daniel addressed the ballroom. "For 11 months, I led Brooks Quantum Systems from outside public view. My accident changed how I moved through the world." He paused. "It also changed how the world moved around me." Several guests lowered their eyes. "I learned that people reveal their values most clearly when they believe the person in front of them has no power." His gaze passed over Preston, over Warren, over Evelyn, then toward the wedding guests seated near the front. "At my wedding, people mocked my wife because they believed she had married a burden." The ballroom became breathless. They ignored her dignity because they saw a librarian from a modest neighborhood standing behind a wheelchair. Grace's eyes filled despite herself. They were wrong about her. Daniel looked toward Grace. "And they were wrong about me." Applause began from the back of the room. Samuel Price, one pair of hands. Then Rebecca, then the executives. Within seconds, the entire ballroom was standing. Grace did not feel vindicated. She felt exposed. The applause seemed less like respect than fear discovering better manners. Daniel raised one hand. The sound faded. "There will be consequences for those who used my absence to exploit this company." Warren went pale. "An independent investigation begins tonight. All Brooks family contracts are suspended pending review." The room erupted in whispers. Preston pushed through the crowd. "Daniel, you cannot do this publicly." Daniel looked at him. "You humiliated my wife publicly." Preston stopped. For the first time, no one laughed with him. Security approached, but Daniel lifted a hand. "Let him stay." Preston's face twisted. "You hid from everyone. You abandoned the company. We kept it alive." Rebecca opened a folder. "You diverted $14 million through related vendors." The room gasped. Warren stepped forward. "That is an allegation." "It is a documented transaction pattern," Rebecca replied. Daniel's voice remained calm. "You believed my chair made me absent." He looked across the silent room. "You believed silence meant surrender." Then he turned toward Grace. The truth is, the only person in this ballroom who treated me as a whole man, never knew my name, controlled anything." Every eye found her. Grace stood beneath the chandeliers, the silver phoenix glowing at her collar. Daniel extended one hand. "Grace." She did not move. The moment stretched. His hand remained open. Grace finally walked toward him, not to take it. She stopped a few feet away. "You should finish without me." His expression changed. "Grace, I came beside you." Her voice was soft, but the microphones carried it across the ballroom. "I will not stand here while people applaud me for passing a test I never agreed to take." No one breathed. Daniel lowered his hand. Grace looked at the audience. "At the wedding, you were silent because you thought we had no power." Her eyes moved slowly through the room. "No. Tonight, you applaud because you learned he does." The words landed harder than any accusation. If dignity changes when wealth enters the room, it was never dignity. She removed the phoenix pin from her dress. Daniel's eyes followed it. Grace placed the pin gently in his palm. "This belongs to the life you chose not to share with me." Then she turned and walked toward the ballroom doors. The crowd parted without being asked. No one whispered. No one laughed. No one dared stop her. Daniel sat beneath the silver phoenix with the entire company waiting for his next word. But for the first time that evening, the billionaire chairman had nothing to say. The ballroom doors closed behind Grace. Outside, cold night air met her face as she stepped beneath the hotel lights. Black cars waited at the curb. Cameras flashed through the glass behind her. Grace kept walking. And inside the ballroom, every person who had mistaken silence for weakness finally understood that power had changed the room, but dignity had already left it. The cold outside cut through the thin fabric of Grace's gown. She moved beneath the hotel canopy, past black sedans and valets holding umbrellas, until the noise from the ballroom faded behind heavy glass doors. Charlotte glittered around her. Traffic rolled along Tryon Street. Red brake lights stretched across the wet pavement. A street musician packed his saxophone beneath an awning while hotel guests in evening clothes hurried around him without looking. Grace stopped at the corner. She had no coat, no ride. Her canvas tote still hung from her shoulder, looking almost defiant against the elegant blue gown. A limousine driver approached. "Mrs. Brooks?" Grace turned. "Mr. Brooks asked me to take you home." She looked back toward the hotel. Through the glass, she could see shadows moving beneath chandeliers. "No, thank you. It's raining. I've walked in worse." The driver hesitated. "Ma'am," he said. "I heard what he said all evening." Her tone was not cruel, only final. She crossed the street as the light changed. Behind her, the driver lifted his phone. Inside the ballroom, Daniel's own phone vibrated. Grace refused the car. Daniel read the message once, then again. Rebecca stood beside him while investors whispered across the room. Warren Brooks had disappeared into a private corridor with 2 attorneys. Preston remained near the bar, pale and angry, speaking urgently into his phone. Evelyn sat at an empty table with both hands wrapped around a champagne glass she had not touched. Daniel watched the doors through which Grace had left. "Go after her," Rebecca said. He looked down at the corruption file in his lap. "If I leave now, Warren controls the story before midnight." Rebecca's expression hardened. "And if you stay, what do you control?" "The company. You may lose your marriage." The words struck, but Daniel did not move. A board member approached. "Mr. Chairman, the press has already begun asking questions. We need a statement." Daniel's gaze remained on their doors. "No statement. Sir, the stock could react by morning." "Then let it react." The board member lowered his voice. "There are pension funds, hospitals, and public systems invested in this company. This is larger than a family dispute." Daniel finally looked at him. "My relatives stole from those same investors." "Yes, sir." "Then we tell the truth." The board member nodded and stepped away. Rebecca watched Daniel's face. "You built an empire because facts made sense to you." He said nothing. "Grace is not a balance sheet." "I know." "No, you know the words." She gathered the folders from the table. "You still think fear becomes wisdom if you explain it carefully enough." Daniel looked toward the elevators. "Find out where she goes. I already have security watching from a distance." His expression sharpened. "Do not follow her." Rebecca held his gaze. She walked alone into the rain wearing a formal gown while cameras surrounded the hotel. She hates being watched. She also deserves to arrive safely. Daniel looked away. "Keep your people far back." Rebecca nodded. Grace did not go home. At the first bus stop, she sat beneath a scratched plastic shelter while rain tapped against the roof. A city bus arrived with a long hiss. The driver, a gray-haired woman named Denise Harper, opened the doors and stared at Grace's dress. "Wedding?" Grace stepped aboard. "Something like that." Denise glanced at the silver fare box. Grace searched her tote. Her transit card was gone. She had given it to Renee Wallace days earlier. Grace found 2 crumpled dollar bills and several coins. Denise covered the fare slot with one hand. "Sit down. I can pay." "I know." Denise looked at Grace's face. "Sit down anyway." Grace did. The bus carried her away from the glass towers and hotel lights. Passengers climbed aboard in work boots, grocery uniforms, nursing scrubs, and rain jackets. No one recognized her as the woman who had just walked out of a Billionaire's gala. That anonymity felt like air. Near Trade Street, an older man boarded with a cane and struggled to balance as the bus moved. Grace immediately stood. "Take my seat." The man looked at her gown. "Ma'am, you look like you're having a worse night than I am." "My shoes still work." He accepted the seat. Grace held the overhead rail for the rest of the ride. At West Boulevard, she stepped off beside a laundromat glowing beneath harsh fluorescent lights. Her library stood dark across the street. The community kitchen was closed. Only the small diner on the corner remained open, its red neon sign buzzing through the rain. Grace entered. Warm air and the smell of coffee wrapped around her. 3 overnight workers sat at the counter. A waitress named Patricia Lane, 64, looked Grace up and down without judgment. "You need food or quiet?" Grace almost laughed. "Both." Patricia pointed toward a booth in the back. "I can manage that." Grace sat beside the window. Rain crawled down the glass in silver lines. Patricia brought coffee and a plate of eggs without asking. "I didn't order." "You also didn't come in here dressed like that because the night went well." Grace wrapped her hands around the mug. "How much?" "Later." Grace looked toward the empty street. After several minutes, Patricia slid into the opposite side of the booth. "You want to talk?" "No." "Good." Patricia picked up the sugar dispenser and refilled it. "People tell too much to strangers." Grace smiled faintly. Patricia continued. "But silence can turn poisonous if you hold it too long." Grace stared into the coffee. "My husband lied to me." "About another woman?" "No." "Money?" Grace looked up. Patricia raised an eyebrow. "That bad?" "He owns a company. Most men I've known can barely own their mistakes." Despite herself, Grace laughed. It came out tired and broken. Patricia's face softened. "Oh, how big a company?" $12 billion. The sugar dispenser stopped moving. Patricia placed it carefully on the table. "Well?" Grace waited for amazement. Instead, Patricia said, "That is a very large lie." Grace's eyes filled. "Everyone thinks I should be grateful." "For being lied to?" "For the money." Patricia shook her head. "Money changes the size of a house. It doesn't change the size of a promise." Grace looked down. "He said he was afraid I would see the money before I saw him." "And what did he see when he looked at you?" "A woman who had to be tested." The words finally broke something. Grace pressed a napkin against her eyes. She did not sob. She simply sat with the quiet humiliation of realizing that the man she had defended against every cruel assumption had built one of his own around her. Patricia remained nearby without touching her. After a while, Grace whispered, "Poverty never scared me. I figured, I've lost jobs. I've had eviction notices. I've stretched soup for 3 days and walked to work because bus fare had to become laundry money." She looked through the rain-streaked window. "I can survive not having things." Her voice tightened. "I don't know if I can survive being loved like a suspicion." Across town, Daniel sat in the private executive suite of Brooks Quantum Systems. The gala had ended. The ballroom had emptied. He had returned to headquarters with Rebecca, 3 board members, and federal compliance counsel. Files covered the table. The evidence was worse than expected. Preston had routed software licensing payments through a shell corporation in Delaware. Warren had directed charitable grants toward a foundation controlled by his longtime business partner. 2 senior vice presidents had received consulting fees for projects that did not exist. Daniel read in silence. Rebecca placed another document before him. "This one involves the rehabilitation center where you met Grace." Daniel looked up. "What?" "A donation was made in your name 6 months ago." "I did not authorize it." "It was not from you." Rebecca turned the page. The amount was modest. $300 each month. Paid through cashier's checks. The donor line was blank. Daniel recognized the date. "Grace's payday," Rebecca continued. "We traced 6 payments to the West Boulevard Branch Library's Employee Credit Union." Daniel stared at the page. She funded the adult reading room and the evening transportation vouchers. With what money? Her salary. Daniel leaned back. Images returned. Grace repairing the old umbrella instead of buying a new one. Giving away her transit pass. Wearing borrowed pearls to the wedding. Living in the same small rental house. He had assumed she was careful with money because she had little. He had never understood that she had less because she kept giving it away. Rebecca placed a tablet on the table. The bus station video appeared. Grace kneeling beside Raymond Carter, her cardigan around his shoulders, her voice calm beneath the rain, because everybody walked past. Daniel shut off the screen. Rebecca sat across from him. You asked us to investigate whether Grace wanted something from you. He looked at her sharply. I never said that. You did not have to. Daniel lowered his eyes. Rebecca continued. She wanted honesty. The room went still. An attorney entered carrying another folder. We found more. Daniel looked up. More fraud? Yes. The attorney opened the file. But not only financial misconduct. Inside were emails between Warren, Preston, and a public relations consultant. One subject line read, competency narrative. Another, wife as undue influence. A third, post-nuptial refusal, evidentiary value. Daniel read the messages. They had planned everything, the insulting agreement, the check, the private lounge, even the photographer. They had expected Grace to become angry. If she accepted the money, they would call her greedy. If she refused, they would call her controlling. If Daniel defended her, they would present it as proof that she had compromised his judgment. She was never the target, Daniel said. Rebecca shook her head. She was the weapon. Daniel's face hardened. The attorney continued. Warren intends to request an emergency competency review at tomorrow's shareholders' meeting. On what grounds? Your absence, your marriage, and tonight's suspension of family contracts. Daniel looked toward the city beyond the glass. The lights of Charlotte burned beneath the clouds. And if I protect the family? Rebecca answered quietly. They continue stealing. If I expose them, they will say Grace turned me against them. Daniel's hands tightened against the chair. For years, his family had used silence as protection. Do not discuss the accident. Do not appear weak. Do not embarrass the name. Do not challenge blood in public. Now that silence had become a machine built to crush the only person who had loved him without knowing what he owned. Schedule the emergency shareholders meeting, Daniel said. Rebecca watched him carefully. For when? Tomorrow afternoon. The attorney hesitated. Federal investigators will want access to the records. Give them everything. Even the family trusts, especially those. Rebecca closed the file. And Grace? Daniel looked at the empty place beside him. I will tell the truth whether she comes or not. At the diner, Patricia brought Grace a dry cardigan from the lost and found box. It was too large and smelled faintly of fabric softener. Grace put it on anyway. Her phone vibrated. 23 missed calls, most from unknown numbers. 4 from Daniel, 1 message. I was afraid money would make you see me differently. I never considered what secrecy would make you see in yourself. I am sorry. Grace read it twice. She did not reply. Patricia returned with the bill. Grace reached into her tote. Patricia folded the paper and slipped it into her apron. Breakfast is on me. I can pay. I know. That seems to be everyone's answer tonight. Patricia smiled. Then maybe people are finally learning something. Grace looked toward the dark library across the street. What time is it? Almost 2. Grace stood. I need to go home. To him? To my house? Patricia nodded, as if she understood the distinction. Outside, the rain had stopped. The sky remained black, but a faint silver line had begun forming beyond the rooftops. Grace walked the final blocks alone. When she reached the rental house, the porch light was on. Daniel sat outside in his wheelchair with no coat. He had been waiting. Grace stopped at the gate. He did not move toward her. "I know where you were," he said. Her expression hardened. "I told security to stay back. You had me followed again, to make sure you were safe. You still do not understand." "I am beginning to." Grace opened the gate. Daniel looked exhausted. "The family is calling an emergency shareholders meeting. That is your business. They're going to use you to remove me." Grace paused. Daniel continued. "They staged the agreement, the offer, the photographs. They wanted evidence that you were manipulating me. And were they wrong?" The question cut deeper than anger. Daniel answered honestly. "About you, yes. About you hiding things from me? No." Grace stepped onto the porch. "What are you going to do?" "Expose them." "Publicly?" "Yes. Because they stole from your company." "Yes." She waited. Daniel added, "And because I will not allow them to turn your dignity into evidence against you." Grace studied him. "You should have protected it before they entered the room." "I know." This time the words did not sound automatic. They sounded like surrender. Daniel reached into his jacket and removed the phoenix pin. Grace looked at it, but did not take it. "Tomorrow," he said, "I will tell every shareholder who I am, where I have been, and what my family did." "And what will you say about me?" "The truth." "What truth?" Daniel held her gaze. "That you loved me before you knew I had power." Grace's voice remained quiet. "That is your truth." He looked confused. She continued. "Mine is that you had power all along and still let me stand alone." The porch light hummed above them. Daniel lowered the pin. Grace unlocked the front door. Before entering, she looked back. "I may come tomorrow." Hope moved across his face. "Not for you." It disappeared. "I will come, because if they use my name in that room, I will hear it with my own ears." She stepped inside. Daniel remained on the porch as the door closed. Across Charlotte, phones began ringing in executive homes before sunrise. Federal investigators received encrypted files. Board members canceled flights. Reporters heard rumors of an emergency meeting. Warren Brooks summoned attorneys. Preston deleted messages that had already been copied. And in the quiet house on West Boulevard, Grace removed her wedding gown, folded it carefully, and placed it inside the same closet where her library clothes waited. The blue fabric carried the faint scent of rain and hotel flowers. She closed the door. By morning, the world would be watching Daniel Brooks reclaim his company. But the only judgment he feared belonged to the woman who no longer knew whether reclaiming power could repair the trust he had spent months hiding behind it. The headquarters of Brooks Quantum Systems rose into the gray Carolina sky like polished steel catching the first light after a storm. Television vans lined the opposite side of the street. Reporters gathered behind temporary barriers, speaking into cameras as employees streamed through the revolving doors with unusual silence. Rumors had spread overnight. Investors were demanding answers. Financial news channels had interrupted their regular programming to cover the emergency shareholders meeting. Inside the lobby, the silver phoenix shimmered above a wall of black marble. Employees who had worked at Brooks Quantum for decades slowed as Daniel entered through the private entrance. Many had never seen him in person. Some had worked under his leadership for years while knowing him only as a voice in encrypted meetings and carefully worded directives. Now they quietly stepped aside. Not because he was wealthy, because the man they thought had disappeared had returned. Daniel acknowledged them with a nod. Nothing theatrical, nothing triumphant. He had spent too many months hidden to enjoy becoming a spectacle. Rebecca Sloan met him outside the executive conference floor. "The regulators are here." "I expected them." The independent auditors arrived 30 minutes ago. Good. And Warren has already gathered supporters. Daniel smiled without humor. He always preferred arriving early when he planned to rewrite history. Rebecca handed him a thin folder. This contains only verified evidence. Daniel opened it. Every transfer, every forged authorization, every fraudulent consulting agreement, every internal email. Each page represented another crack in the carefully polished image his relatives had protected for years. He closed the folder. Has Grace arrived? Rebecca hesitated. I don't know. Daniel lowered his eyes for a moment. Then he nodded once. Let's begin. Across the city, Grace stood outside the library. She had not gone inside. Instead, she watched the morning news playing through the electronics store window across the street. The headlines stretched across the bottom of every screen. Brooks Quantum chairman to appear publicly after months of seclusion. A photograph from the gala filled the screen. Daniel in his wheelchair, Grace walking beside him. The anchor spoke confidently. Markets are expected to react sharply, depending on today's announcements. Grace barely heard the rest. Someone beside her spoke. You planning to stand out here all morning? It was Patricia from the diner, carrying 2 coffees. I brought you one. Grace accepted it. You've been watching that screen for 15 minutes. I know. Going? Grace looked toward the skyline. I don't know. Patricia sipped her coffee. When my husband died, people kept telling me forgiveness was a decision. Grace listened quietly. They were wrong. What was it? A direction. Grace frowned slightly. You don't wake up one morning already there. Patricia smiled gently. You just decide which way you're walking. Grace looked down at her coffee. I don't know where I'm walking. You know exactly where. Patricia nodded toward downtown. The question is whether you're walking toward anger. She paused. Or toward answers. Grace looked once more at the television, then at the bus pulling toward the curb. Without another word, she stepped aboard. The shareholders' meeting filled the largest conference hall in the building. Rows of investors, corporate attorneys, independent directors, regulators, financial journalists seated behind a glass partition. No applause, only expectation. At the front sat Warren Brooks. Perfect suit, perfect smile, perfect confidence. He leaned toward Preston. He'll lose control before lunch. Preston nodded. He shouldn't have shown himself. The company secretary stood. This emergency meeting of Brooks Quantum Systems will come to order. Microphones activated. Digital voting panels illuminated. The secretary continued. The first item concerns questions regarding executive leadership and governance. Warren rose smoothly. Before we proceed, I would like to acknowledge the extraordinary work performed by this company, despite unfortunate circumstances. He spoke like a practiced statesman. For nearly a year, Brooks Quantum has operated without visible executive leadership. He looked around the room. Our chairman has suffered greatly. Several sympathetic nods appeared. We all wish him continued healing. His tone shifted. But shareholders deserve transparency. Another pause. They deserve certainty. He rested both hands on the podium. A corporation of this size cannot depend upon secrecy. He allowed the sentence to settle. Recent events, including unfortunate family controversies now dominating national headlines, raise legitimate questions regarding the chairman's judgment. Several cameras focused on him. We therefore recommend an immediate governance review. Applause scattered through one section of the room. Not many. Enough. Warren continued. This recommendation is made with compassion. The rear doors opened. Every head turned. Daniel entered. The applause stopped. He moved steadily down the center aisle. Not hurried, not dramatic, simply present. Rebecca walked several steps behind. Grace entered moments later. She chose the last row. No announcement, no escort. She quietly took an empty seat. Daniel noticed her immediately. Their eyes met for only a second. Then he continued forward. The secretary cleared his throat. "Mr. Chairman," Daniel nodded. "I'll begin." He positioned his wheelchair beside the podium rather than behind it. "I've listened." His voice carried easily through the room. "Now you'll listen." Silence answered him. For 11 months, I continued leading Brooks Quantum Systems. Several investors exchanged confused looks. Daniel pressed a button. The large screen behind him illuminated. Video conferences, electronic signatures, time-stamped directives, recorded board approvals, encrypted executive meetings. Each image carried precise dates. I did not disappear. He looked toward Warren. I simply stopped appearing. Another button. A chart appeared. Revenue, research expansion, patent approvals, international partnerships. The company achieved its strongest operating performance in its history during my absence. Murmurs spread. Daniel continued calmly. "The issue before this room is not whether Brooks Quantum had leadership." He opened the evidence folder. "The issue is who attempted to exploit the illusion that it did not." Rebecca stepped forward. Auditors distributed copies of financial reports. Federal investigators received matching digital files. Warren's confidence began slipping. "What is this?" one investor whispered. Daniel answered without looking up. "Evidence." He projected the first document. A consulting contract. Shell Corporation. Wire transfers. Approvals. Electronic authentication. Dates. The 2nd, the 3rd, the 4th. Every document pointed toward the same group. Warren Brooks. Preston Brooks. 3 senior executives. Outside legal consultants. Every accusation carried supporting documentation. No speculation. Only records. Daniel never raised his voice. He simply explained. "These payments were concealed through related entities." Another page. "These vendor invoices were fabricated." Another. "These charitable grants never reached their intended recipients." Another. "These signatures were obtained through unauthorized duplication of executive credentials." The room grew colder. No one interrupted. The facts required no emotion. Federal investigators stood. One quietly spoke into a phone. Another received a sealed envelope from Rebecca. Warren suddenly laughed. A strained, desperate laugh. "You expect everyone to believe this?" Daniel looked directly at him. "No." He pressed another button. A recording began. Warren's own voice filled the room. "He'll never know. As long as he stays hidden, we control every decision that matters." The recording continued. Preston discussing Grace. "If the wife accepts money, she's greedy." Another voice. "If she refuses, we'll say she's manipulating him." Grace closed her eyes. She remembered the private lounge, the insulting agreement, the photographers. Everything had indeed been planned. Around her, shareholders slowly turned toward Warren. Not with sympathy, with disbelief. Warren stood abruptly. "Those recordings were illegally obtained," Rebecca answered. "They were obtained under judicial authorization after evidence of financial misconduct." Another screen appeared. Federal authorization, court order, compliance signatures. Perfectly legal, perfectly devastating. Preston stood. "This is revenge." Daniel looked at him quietly. "No," he paused. "This is accounting." The room remained silent. Grace watched Daniel. For the first time since learning the truth, she saw no billionaire, no hidden chairman, no carefully managed mystery, only a tired man who had finally decided that secrecy could no longer protect anything worth saving. The company secretary rose again. "Federal investigators request immediate preservation of all electronic records." Rebecca nodded. "They have already been preserved." Security officers quietly approached Warren and Preston. not to arrest them, only to ensure they remained available for questioning. Several shareholders requested the microphone. One elderly investor stood first. "I've owned Brooks Quantum stock since the company employed fewer than 50 people. He looked toward Daniel. "I invested because I trusted your judgment." Then he turned toward Warren. "I never invested in yours." Applause began. This time it was restrained, respectful, not celebration, recognition. Daniel lifted one hand. The applause faded. "There remains one matter." The room settled again. Daniel looked toward the final row. His eyes found Grace. She remained seated, hands folded, expression unreadable. Daniel spoke more softly. "My relatives believed my greatest vulnerability was my wheelchair." He shook his head. They were wrong. His gaze never left Grace. "My greatest vulnerability was believing I had to hide the only thing that never needed protection." Grace looked back at him. He continued, "I've spoken enough about fraud." He closed the evidence folder. "Now I'd like to speak about wealth." Several reporters leaned forward. Daniel smiled faintly. "Not mine." Confused expressions spread. "The wealth that saved my life." He turned completely toward Grace. The room followed his eyes. For the first time that morning, every shareholder noticed the woman sitting quietly in the last row. The black librarian. The same woman many had seen mocked across television broadcasts from the wedding. The woman who asked for nothing. The woman who had almost disappeared into the background again. Daniel drew a slow breath. Before anyone in this room knew her name, he paused. She was already changing lives. Grace's heartbeat quickened. Rebecca looked toward her with gentle understanding. Daniel continued, "And before anyone calls her the chairman's wife," he smiled sadly, "I want this company to understand exactly who Grace Mitchell truly is." The room became utterly silent. Every camera turned toward the final row. Grace slowly stood. Not because she wanted attention, because she realized there was no longer any place left to hide. Grace stood in the final row, while hundreds of faces turned toward her. The conference hall had been built to make ordinary people feel small. Its ceiling rose 3 stories above polished stone. Screens glowed across the front wall, cameras pointed from behind glass. Men and women in tailored suits sat behind nameplates representing pension funds, universities, hospitals, and investment firms. Grace wore the same navy dress she had worn to work the day before. No stylist, no jewelry except her wedding ring, no phoenix pin. She could hear the soft clicking of cameras as reporters adjusted their focus. Daniel watched her from the front of the room. He had imagined this moment differently. In his mind, Grace would understand why he needed the shareholders to see her. She would hear what he planned to say and recognize it as gratitude. Now, seeing the uncertainty in her face, he understood something he should have learned much earlier. Even praise could become another form of exposure when it was offered without permission. He lowered the microphone. "Grace," he said, "you do not have to come forward." The room waited. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she stepped into the aisle. Her shoes made almost no sound against the carpet. She walked slowly toward the front, passing shareholders who had remained silent at the wedding, executives who had investigated her, and relatives who had tried to turn her love into evidence. No one reached for her, no one whispered. The same kind of silence that once abandoned her now made way for her. Grace stopped several feet from Daniel. He did not ask her to stand beside his chair. He turned toward the audience instead. Months before Grace knew who I was, she volunteered every Thursday at the East Charlotte Rehabilitation Center. A photograph appeared on the screen. It showed the center's reading room. Nothing glamorous. Faded walls, metal bookshelves, a row of mismatched chairs. Grace looked toward Rebecca. "How did you get that?" Rebecca remained near the side wall. "With permission from the center." Daniel continued. Grace delivered books, prepared meals, completed benefit forms, and sat with adults whose families had stopped visiting. Another photograph appeared. Harold Jenkins, 74, smiling beside a birthday cobbler. Then Thomas Bell holding completed transportation forms. Then Renee Wallace standing near the repaired elevator in her apartment building. Grace's expression tightened. None of the photographs showed people at their worst. No hospital beds, no injuries, no tears, only restored moments. Daniel had made certain of that. None of these people were clients, he said. She received no salary from them. She requested no recognition. He looked toward Grace. She did not even tell me most of their names. Grace spoke quietly. They trusted me. The microphones caught her words. Daniel nodded. That is why we obtained their permission before showing anything. The screen changed. A series of cashier's checks appeared. $300, another $300, another month after month. The rehabilitation center believed these payments came from an anonymous donor. Grace closed her eyes briefly. Daniel continued. They paid for adult literacy materials, evening bus passes, and meals for patients attending late therapy sessions. Murmurs moved through the room. One payment arrived during a month when Grace's own electric bill was overdue. Grace looked at Daniel sharply. He met her eyes. I should not know that. No, she said. You should not. A few people shifted uncomfortably. Daniel did not defend himself. You are right. The room became still again. I learned it because my legal team investigated whether Grace had financial motives for marrying me. The admission moved through the hall like a cold wind. Rebecca lowered her eyes. Several board members looked toward one another. Daniel did not soften the truth. I approved that investigation. Grace's face remained composed, but the hurt was visible now. I told myself I was protecting the company. He looked around the room. I was protecting my fear. No one applauded. Daniel had not earned applause, he continued. The investigation found no hidden debt, no secret contact with my relatives, no attempt to discover my identity. The screen showed a photograph taken at the bus station. Grace kneeling beside Raymond Carter beneath the rain, her cardigan around his shoulders, her hand holding a cloth against his forehead. The image had been cropped carefully to preserve Raymond's dignity. Grace stared at it. That should not be here. Natalie Cole rose from a seat near the wall. I recorded it. Grace turned. Natalie's voice shook. I was following you that night. The room stirred. Grace looked at Rebecca. Rebecca answered before she could ask. I sent her. Natalie stepped into the aisle. I was supposed to find evidence that you were pretending to be kind. Her face flushed with shame. Instead, I watched you give your transit pass to an elderly woman, work an unpaid shift at the community kitchen, and stay with an injured veteran while everyone else boarded the bus. Grace said nothing. Natalie continued. When I told you I had recorded him, you asked me to delete it because his worst moment was not entertainment. She swallowed. I did not delete it. Grace's expression hardened. I know. I am sorry. The apology sounded small in the enormous room. Grace looked toward the image. Did Mr. Carter agree to this? Rebecca answered. Yes. He reviewed the photograph himself. Another image appeared. Raymond Carter stood outside a veterans housing office wearing a clean field jacket. Beneath the photograph was a statement in his own words. She didn't save me. She reminded me I was still worth saving. Grace covered her mouth. For the first time that morning, her calm nearly broke. Daniel watched her. His voice softened. The world keeps asking what Grace saw in a man in a wheelchair. He looked toward the shareholders. That is the wrong question. He paused. The question is, why so many people required a balance sheet before they could see what she had already seen. The hall was silent. At the wedding, Grace was mocked because people believed she had chosen a burden. Daniel's hands rested quietly in his lap. But when I met her, I had already become a burden to myself. Grace looked at him. He continued. I had money, authority, patents, buildings, and thousands of employees. His voice lowered. I did not believe any of it made me worthy of being loved. The screen went dark. No photographs now, no documents. Only Daniel. Grace brought me soup when she believed I could not repay her. A faint, sad smile crossed his face. She read to men everyone else had forgotten. She remembered birthdays. She learned which patients hated peas and which ones pretended not to be lonely. A few people laughed softly through tears. She never asked what company I had built. He looked directly at her. She asked what kind of man pain had left behind. Grace's eyes filled. Daniel turned back toward the room. So do not call her the billionaire's wife as though that is the highest thing she became. His voice grew steadier. She was rich before she met me. A reporter near the glass partition lowered her pen. Daniel continued. She possessed the kind of wealth this company cannot manufacture. He counted quietly. Patience, courage, attention, the refusal to walk past another person's suffering. Then he looked toward Grace again. She restored my belief that I was still a man before she knew I was a chairman. The silence in this room changed. It was no longer fear. It was recognition arriving too late. Daniel moved his wheelchair away from the podium. This company has spent years developing systems that connect hospitals, emergency teams, and vulnerable communities. He looked toward the shareholders, but we failed inside our own house. Several executives lowered their eyes. We measured risk carefully. He glanced at Rebecca, and humanity poorly. Rebecca accepted the judgment without looking away. Daniel continued. Effective immediately, Brooks Quantum Systems will establish an independent dignity and access commission with authority to audit hiring, disability accommodation, vendor treatment, and executive conduct. The screen illuminated again. Not photographs this time, a formal resolution. The commission will not report to the Brooks family. Warren shifted in his seat near federal counsel. It will report directly to independent directors and community representatives. Daniel looked toward Grace. I had intended to name Grace as its chair. She straightened. He raised one hand before the room could react. I no longer intend to. Surprise moved through the audience. Because I did not ask her. Grace's breathing changed. Daniel continued. If she ever chooses to participate, it will be on terms she writes herself. He turned toward the secretary. Record that. The secretary nodded. Grace studied Daniel. For the first time since the gala, he had given something without arranging her response in advance. A shareholder near the front slowly stood. It was the elderly investor who had defended Daniel earlier. He looked toward Grace. Mrs. Brooks, I was at your wedding. Grace recognized him. He had sat near the staircase. He had heard Preston's joke. He had said nothing. The man's voice trembled. I saw what happened. Grace waited. I told myself it was a private family matter. He looked down. That was cowardice dressed as manners. No one moved. I apologize. Grace held his gaze. Thank you for saying it. Another person stood. A hospital trustee. Then a university president. Then one of the country club guests. One after another, they admitted what they had seen and what they had failed to do. Some apologies were sincere. Some were clumsy. Some arrived only because the room now made silence uncomfortable. Grace listened to each without offering immediate forgiveness. When the last person sat, she stepped toward the microphone. Daniel moved back to give her space. Grace looked across the hall. At the wedding, many of you believed Daniel had no power. Her voice was clear. You believed I had even less. She paused. That is why your silence felt safe. Several faces lowered. Today, you know who he is. She looked toward Daniel. You know what he owns. Then back to the audience. And suddenly, everyone has found words. No one interrupted. Grace continued. I appreciate every honest apology. Her tone remained humane, but apology is not proven in a room like this. She looked toward the employees standing along the walls. It is proven the next time a delivery worker enters your lobby. The next time an older employee needs more time. The next time someone speaks with an accent, uses a wheelchair, wears inexpensive clothes, or cannot offer you anything. Her hand rested lightly against the podium. That is where your apology will either live or die. A quiet sound rose from the back. Not applause yet. A few people standing, then more. Grace lifted one hand. Please. The room settled. I do not need applause. Her eyes moved toward Daniel. I needed honesty. Daniel accepted the words. Grace stepped away from the microphone. As she passed his chair, he spoke quietly. I am sorry. She stopped. Not for the room, not for the cameras, only for him. I believe you are becoming sorry, she said. It was not forgiveness, but it was not goodbye. Daniel's eyes closed briefly. Grace walked towards the doors. This time he did not ask her to stay. He did not send security. He did not follow. He let her choose the direction. Outside the conference hall, Samuel Price waited beside the silver phoenix mounted on the wall. Grace stopped near him. You knew the man before the money became invisible. Samuel smiled gently. I knew the money before I knew the man. He looked toward the closed doors. You may be the first person who truly did it the other way around. Grace looked through the glass at Daniel speaking quietly with federal counsel. Knowing a person is not the same as trusting him. No, Samuel nodded. But sometimes truth has to empty the room before trust can decide whether to return. The conference doors opened behind them. Rebecca emerged carrying a sealed folder. Mrs. Brooks. Grace turned. Rebecca extended it. What is this? Daniel's final announcement. Grace did not take it. He said he would not make another decision involving you without your consent. Rebecca placed the folder on a nearby table. So he asked me to give you the choice. Grace looked at the envelope. Her name was written across the front in Daniel's handwriting. Inside the conference hall, reporters began broadcasting the downfall of the Brooks family faction. Federal investigators escorted Warren and Preston toward private interview rooms. Board members signed emergency suspensions. Markets reacted. Contracts froze. A company worth billions began changing direction. But Grace stood in the quiet hallway, staring at a plain envelope. Whatever waited inside had nothing to do with stock prices. And for the first time since learning who Daniel truly was, the next decision belonged entirely to her. Grace stood beside the hallway table until the noise from the conference room faded into a distant murmur. The envelope looked ordinary. Cream paper, her name written in Daniel's careful hand. No company seal, no attorney's initials, no silver phoenix. She opened it slowly. Inside was a single sheet. Grace, I have spent most of my life deciding what other people needed before asking them. I called it leadership when it worked. I called it protection when it hurt someone. Both names allowed me to remain in control. So I am not giving you a position, a foundation, a trust, or an apology tied to a condition. I am giving you 3 signed resignations. 1 from the Brooks Family Trust, 1 from the Foundation Committee, 1 from the Dignity and Access Commission. You may accept none of them, one of them, or all of them. You may rewrite every term. You may never speak to me again. Nothing in your decision will change what is already yours by law or what I owe you as your husband. For once, I will not arrange the ending. Daniel Grace read the letter twice. Rebecca remained several feet away, giving her privacy. Samuel looked through the glass toward the city. Grace folded the page. He thinks surrendering control will fix what controlling damaged, Rebecca answered carefully. No. Grace looked at her. I think he understands it may not. Inside the conference hall, federal investigators began sealing executive offices. Warren Brooks sat between two attorneys with his face drained of color. Preston's phone had been taken for forensic review. 3 senior executives received immediate suspension notices before they could leave the building. Outside, news crews reported the first wave of consequences. Fraud inquiries, frozen accounts, resigned directors, canceled contracts. Grace watched the screens mounted above the lobby. For weeks, she had imagined justice as a door slamming shut. Now it looked more like paperwork. Quiet, methodical, unavoidable. Her phone vibrated. Linda from the library. Grace answered. You all right? Linda asked. I think so. Half the city is talking about you. That does not improve the answer. Linda sighed. There are reporters outside the branch. Grace closed her eyes. I'm sorry. Don't be. I told them the library opens at 9 and gossip is not a public service. Grace smiled. Linda continued. Thomas Bell is here. At this hour? He saw the meeting on television. A man's voice came through the background. Tell her I'm proud of her. Grace's throat tightened. Linda lowered her voice. Renee called too. Raymond Carter sent a message through the veterans office. The people you helped are worried everyone will turn your kindness into a story about Daniel's money. Grace looked at the conference hall. They already tried. What are you going to do? Grace stared at Daniel's letter. I'm going to stop letting other people decide what my story is for. She ended the call. Rebecca stepped closer. Mrs. Brooks, federal counsel would like to speak with you. About what? The postnuptial meeting. Grace looked toward the closed doors. I'll speak. A private interview room had been prepared on the executive floor. 2 federal investigators waited inside with a court reporter. Both introduced themselves, explained that Grace was not accused of wrongdoing, and asked permission to record. Grace agreed. For 40 minutes, she described the wedding humiliation, the private lounge, the agreement, the check, and the photographs. She did not exaggerate. She did not guess. When she did not know something, she said so. One investigator placed the torn check inside a clear evidence sleeve. Mrs. Brooks, do you believe Warren Brooks offered this money to influence your decisions regarding your husband? Grace considered the question. Yes. Do you want to pursue a personal civil claim? No. The investigator looked surprised. You may have grounds. I understand. May I ask why not? Grace folded her hands. Because I want the evidence used where it protects more than me. The investigator waited. Grace continued. If those attorneys helped build traps like this for other spouses, employees, or disabled adults, investigate that. She looked at the clear sleeve. If the family trusts paid for it, follow the money. You are declining personal damages? I am declining revenge. Her voice remained calm. Justice can still proceed. The court reporter looked up briefly. The interview ended near sunset. When Grace returned to the main conference floor, the building had begun emptying. Employees moved through the hallways carrying cardboard boxes from suspended offices. Security staff collected access cards. Lawyers spoke quietly beside elevators. A company changing leadership did not look heroic. It looked tired. Daniel waited alone near the windows. His tuxedo jacket was gone. His tie had been loosened. The silver phoenix pin rested on the table beside him. Grace approached. He did not turn immediately. I heard you declined a personal claim, he said. People talk quickly in this building. They are afraid of silence now. Grace stopped beside him. Fear is not reform. No. He looked out over Charlotte. Warren and Preston are being removed from every company position. The board approved a permanent ban on family-controlled vendor contracts. And the executives who helped them? Suspended pending investigation. Not quietly retired? No. Grace nodded. Daniel looked at her. I wanted to ask what you thought should happen. You already acted. Yes. Then why ask? Because I am trying to learn the difference between consultation and permission after the decision is made. Grace studied him. That may take time. I have time. You have a company in crisis. I have both. He gestured toward the envelope in her hand. Did you read it? Yes. And? Grace placed it on the table. I do not want the family trust. Daniel accepted the answer. I do not want a foundation seat given to me because I survived your relatives. He nodded. And I will not chair a commission built as an apology. His face fell slightly. Grace continued. But I may help design one that exists whether I forgive you or not. Daniel looked up. On your terms. Entirely. Name them. Not tonight. He almost smiled. That was me arranging the ending again. Yes. Sorry. Becoming sorry, Grace corrected. The faint smile disappeared, replaced by something more honest. I remember. They remained beside the window as the sky turned deep blue over Charlotte. After a while, Daniel asked, What do you want the company to do? Grace looked down at the streets. Your technology connects hospitals. Yes. Then fund access for rehabilitation centers that cannot afford it. We can. Your company gives scholarships to engineering students. Yes. Create grants for adult learners returning after layoffs, injuries, or homelessness. Daniel listened. And pay librarians in underserved communities to run the programs. Grace continued. Do not build shiny centers and expect volunteers to hold them together for free. Daniel nodded. What else? Transportation. Transportation? People miss therapy because the bus comes once an hour. They lose jobs because the accessible van never arrives. They abandon classes because getting across town costs more than the class. Grace's voice strengthened as she spoke. Build dignity into the budget. Daniel repeated the phrase quietly. Dignity into the budget. Yes. Anything else? She looked at him. Do not name it after me. He smiled sadly. I suspected that. Name it after the people it serves. Daniel reached for a legal pad and began writing. Grace watched him. Now? If I wait, someone will turn it into a press release. For several minutes, the only sound was his pen moving across paper. Adult literacy grants, accessible transportation, community rehabilitation technology, paid library coordinators, independent oversight. Grace corrected language when it sounded too corporate. Daniel crossed out the word beneficiaries. What should it say? Participants. He changed it. He wrote empowerment. Grace shook her head. Too vague. Opportunity? Still sounds like a brochure. What would you use? Access. He wrote it down. By the time Rebecca returned, the first page was covered with notes. She glanced between them. Am I interrupting? Yes, Grace said. No, Daniel said at the same time. For 1 second, all three looked at one another. Grace laughed. A real laugh. Small but warm. It surprised Daniel enough that he laughed too. Rebecca set a folder on the table. The board approved the independent compliance restructuring. Daniel nodded. And the Dignity Commission? Awaiting terms. Grace looked toward Rebecca. I have several. Rebecca opened the folder. I expected you might. The next morning, the company issued a public statement. It did not mention Grace's forgiveness. It did not describe Daniel as a victim. It did not call the fraud a family misunderstanding. It named suspended contracts, independent investigators, governance failures, and corrective actions. By noon, Brooks Quantum announced the creation of the Access Forward Initiative, a national program supporting adult literacy, accessible transportation, community rehabilitation centers, and paid public library partnerships. Grace approved the name only after confirming it belonged to no member of the Brooks family. Reporters demanded interviews. She declined them all. Instead, she returned to work. When Grace entered the West Boulevard Library, the usual smell of paper and coffee met her at the door. Linda stood behind the circulation desk. Thomas Bell waited beside the copier. Renee Wallace sat near the computers wearing the same transit pass Grace had given her. Raymond Carter stood near the history shelves in a clean jacket, holding a book he had not yet checked out. No cameras, no chandeliers, no shareholders. Just people. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Thomas lifted one hand. "Morning, Miss Grace." Grace's eyes filled. "Morning." Renee pointed toward a stack of housing forms. "You said you would help me fight the elevator people." Grace set down her tote. "I did." Raymond approached slowly. "They offered me a room through the veterans office." Grace smiled. "Did you take it?" "I did." "Good." He looked embarrassed. "I saw what your husband said." Grace waited. Raymond continued. "He was right about one thing." "What?" "You make people remember they still count." Grace shook her head. "You did that yourself." He smiled. "Maybe you just stood there long enough for me to notice." The library doors opened. Daniel entered alone. No security visible, no suit, no company pin. He wore a plain gray sweater and moved his wheelchair across the worn carpet. The room grew quiet. Grace looked at him. He stopped near the entrance. "I came to return a book." Linda raised an eyebrow. "You have a library card?" Daniel reached into his pocket. "I was told this building has rules." Linda examined the card. "Expired." Daniel looked toward Grace. "Can someone help me?" Grace considered him. Then she walked behind the circulation desk. "Identification?" He handed over his driver's license. She entered his information slowly. Everyone in the room pretended not to watch. When she finished, Grace returned the card. "You owe $3 in late fees." Daniel blinked. $3? "Rules are rules, Mr. Chairman." He removed his wallet. Grace held up one hand. "We do not take billionaire money without exact change." Thomas laughed first, then Renee. Even Raymond smiled. Daniel found 3 $1 bills and placed them on the counter. Grace accepted them. Their fingers touched briefly. Neither pulled away immediately. Daniel lowered his voice. "May I take you to dinner?" Grace looked at him. "As my husband?" "If you still want that word." She held his gaze, as a man asking honestly. "Yes." Grace looked down at the $3. "Dinner." Hope entered his face carefully. "No lawyers?" "No lawyers." "No drivers?" "You can have a driver. Charlotte traffic is bad." He smiled. Grace continued. "But no secrets." The smile faded into solemn agreement. No secrets. Across the library, Linda stamped Daniel's book with unnecessary force. "Due in 3 weeks." Daniel accepted it. "I'll remember." Grace watched him. For the first time, she believed he might. That evening, they ate at Patricia's diner beneath red neon and warm yellow light. No private room, no cameras. Daniel ordered coffee. Grace ordered eggs and toast. Patricia brought both, then placed the bill directly in front of Daniel. "This one is not on their house." He looked up. "I was hoping for special treatment." "You married Grace. You've had enough. Grace laughed. Daniel paid. Outside, buses sighed along the wet street. Inside, two people sat across from one another and began the slower work that justice could not complete for them. No grand apology, no instant forgiveness. Only truth spoken without witnesses. And for the first time, Daniel understood that the most valuable thing Grace had offered him was not devotion without limits. It was the chance to become a man worthy of being trusted again. The months that followed did not move like a victory parade. They moved slowly in signed affidavits, in therapy appointments, in board votes, in quiet dinners where Daniel answered questions he once would have avoided. The federal investigation widened. Warren Brooks was formally charged with financial fraud and conspiracy to misuse company funds. Preston lost every executive title attached to the Brooks name and entered a plea agreement after turning over records from the shell corporations he had helped manage. Two senior executives resigned before the board could remove them, but their departures did not erase the evidence. The company published the findings, not a polished summary, not a carefully softened apology. The full report. Brooks Quantum returned misdirected charitable money to the rehabilitation programs that had been denied it. Vendor contracts were reopened through an independent review. Employees who had reported misconduct and been ignored received formal protection and compensation. Evelyn Brooks did not face criminal charges. Her consequences were quieter. The country club removed her from its events committee after several staff members described years of selective treatment toward guests and workers. She resigned from the Brooks Foundation board when community representatives refused to approve her continued position. For the first time in her life, rooms stopped rearranging themselves around her. Grace never celebrated any of it. When reporters asked whether she felt vindicated, she answered only once. Consequences are not trophies. Then she returned to the library. The Access Forward initiative began in the places Grace had named. A rehabilitation center in Charlotte received updated communication equipment and evening transportation funding. 3 public library branches hired full-time adult literacy coordinators instead of depending entirely on volunteers. A veterans housing office opened a weekly legal and benefits clinic. Bus vouchers were printed without corporate logos. Daniel had suggested placing a small silver phoenix on the cards. Grace had looked at him over her coffee. No advertising on help. He had nodded. The cards remained plain. Their marriage also remained unfinished work. Grace moved back into the small rental house after 6 weeks, but not because Daniel bought flowers or promised change. He did not buy the house. He did not replace the furniture. He did not arrive with a key to a mansion. He came with 2 suitcases, a box of books, and a written list of every property, account, trust, and company obligation tied to his name. He placed the list on the kitchen table. "No more hidden rooms," he said. Grace read every page. Then she gave him a list of her own. No investigations without consent. No security following her unless there was a specific threat. No relatives making decisions about their home. No business calls during dinner unless someone's safety was involved. No using money to end conversations that required patience. Daniel signed the bottom. Grace looked at him. "This is not a contract." "I know." "Then why did you sign it?" "Because I have a bad history with verbal promises." She almost smiled. "Fair." They argued sometimes, about security, about schedules, about how often Daniel worked past midnight, about Grace continuing to walk home when a storm was coming. But the arguments no longer ended with silence. Daniel learned to say, "I am afraid," before fear became control. Grace learned that forgiveness did not require pretending the wound had never happened. Trust returned in small pieces. A shared grocery list. A library card renewed on time. Daniel arriving at the rehabilitation center without an entourage. Grace accepting his help with the kitchen rent. When the request came through a public grant instead of a private check. Neither called it healing. They simply kept choosing the same direction. Nearly a year after the country club wedding, the old warehouse on Remount Road opened its doors, For decades, the building had stored machine parts. Its brick exterior still carried faded lettering from a freight company that had closed years earlier. The loading docks had been converted into accessible entrances. Tall industrial windows filled the interior with afternoon light. The concrete floors had been polished, but not hidden, and old steel beams remained visible beneath the ceiling. Above the entrance, simple black letters read, "The Common Ground Center, no Brooks name, no Mitchell name, no corporate slogan." Inside were adult classrooms, rehabilitation spaces, a technology lab, legal support offices, and a community kitchen with long wooden tables. Every room had been designed after meetings with the people who would use it. Wheelchair users chose the height of the counters. Older adults tested the lighting. Bus riders helped set the evening schedule. Librarians selected the books. Veterans chose the quiet room near the garden. Grace had insisted on one final detail. The front desk had no raised barrier. "No one should have to look up at the person deciding whether they belong," she had said. Opening day arrived beneath a warm September sky. Cars filled the street. City buses stopped at the new shelter outside. Adults from the rehabilitation center entered beside library patrons, nurses, neighborhood residents, and company employees. Thomas Bell wore a new brown jacket. Renee Wallace arrived early and immediately complained that the coffee was too weak. Raymond Carter stood beside a display explaining the center's veterans programs. He had gained weight. His hands no longer shook. Patricia closed the diner for the afternoon and brought 2 trays of pie. Linda Carver guarded the new library shelves as though anyone touching them with unwashed hands might face criminal prosecution. Samuel Price stood near the entrance, wearing his old green concierge jacket. Grace noticed him adjusting the brass buttons. "You kept it," Samuel smiled. "Best uniform I ever wore. You told me you hated that hotel." "I hated some of the guests." He looked around the crowded center. "But that job brought me to a wedding where I finally learned what silence costs." Near the stage, Rebecca Sloan reviewed the opening schedule. Natalie Cole stood beside her with a camera lowered at her side. Grace approached. "Taking pictures?" Natalie nodded. "Only of people who agreed." "Good." Natalie smiled nervously. "I remembered." A small group gathered near the entrance. Grace recognized several faces from the country club wedding. The elderly investor who had apologized at the shareholders' meeting. The photographer who had lowered her camera when Grace was excluded. The event coordinator who had followed Evelyn's seating instructions. They had not been invited as honored guests. They had volunteered. One sorted registration packets, another carried chairs. The wedding photographer was offering free professional portraits to adults applying for jobs. Grace watched them for a moment. Daniel rolled beside her. "Does it bother you? That they're here?" "Yes." Grace considered the question. "No." "Why not?" "Because apology either becomes behavior or it dies." She looked toward the photographer, helping Raymond straighten his collar. "This looks alive." The opening ceremony began at 4. No private seating area had been reserved for executives. Daniel sat in the front row beside Grace, Samuel, Patricia, and several rehabilitation center members. The mayor spoke briefly. Rebecca introduced the independent community board that would govern the center. Then Grace approached the microphone. Sunlight poured through the tall windows behind her, warming the brick walls and turning dust in the air into drifting gold. She looked across the room. A year earlier, another room had watched her push Daniel's wheelchair and decided their marriage was something tragic. This room looked at them differently, but Grace had learned not to trust admiration too quickly. She rested both hands on the podium. This center was not built to rescue people. The crowd quieted. It was built because adults should not have to be rescued from systems that were designed without them. A few heads nodded. It belongs to the person relearning how to use a computer after an injury. To the worker studying for a new career at 50. to the veteran filling out housing forms, to the older neighbor who needs a bus that actually arrives, to the person who enters through those doors believing no one will notice whether they stay or leave. Grace looked toward the open entrance. "We will notice." Applause rose. She let it come this time. Not for her, for the promise. When the room settled, Grace continued. "A year ago, people asked why I would marry a black man in a wheelchair." Daniel looked down, then back at her. They did not ask whether he was kind, whether he was honest. A faint smile touched her lips. He was still working on that one. Laughter moved through the room. Daniel accepted it. They did not ask how he treated nurses, janitors, drivers, or strangers. They saw a chair and decided they understood a man. Grace's voice softened. Then they learned he was a billionaire CEO, and suddenly the same chair looked powerful. The room grew still. That is not the lesson. She looked across every face. The lesson is that the chair never changed. Only their judgment did. Daniel's eyes filled. Grace stepped away from the microphone. "I would like my husband to speak." He rolled toward the stage. There was a ramp, wide and gently sloped. No one rushed to push him. Grace walked beside him. Daniel reached the microphone and looked across the center. "I prepared a speech." Grace glanced at the papers in his lap. He lifted them. "Grace edited it." More laughter. "She removed the part where I thanked 17 corporate committees." "They know what they did," Grace said. Daniel set the pages aside. "So I will say only this." He reached to his lapel. The silver phoenix pin rested there. The same old pin Grace had polished before the country club wedding. The same small detail Samuel had recognized. The same symbol that had opened the hidden door between Daniel's public power and private life. Daniel removed it. "For years, this pin represented the company I built." He looked toward Samuel. To some people, it represented authority. Toward Rebecca. To others, responsibility. Then toward Grace. To my wife, it once represented everything I had hidden. Grace held his gaze. Daniel extended the pin. "Today, I want it to represent something else." He waited. Grace stepped closer. Daniel fastened the silver phoenix to her jacket. His hands moved carefully. "This belongs to the person who taught me that leadership begins before anyone knows your title." The room remained silent. Daniel continued. "It begins when someone is injured at a bus stop. When an elderly neighbor cannot complete a form. When a patient has no visitor. When a bride is humiliated in front of a room full of people." His voice tightened. "And someone chooses not to look away." He lowered his hands. Grace saw worth before power arrived. Grace touched the pin. For one moment, she remembered returning it to him beneath the gala chandeliers. This time, he had not given it as proof of who he was. He had given it in recognition of who she had always been. Applause filled the warehouse. Thomas Bell stood. Then Renee. Then Raymond. Samuel's hands came together slowly. Patricia wiped her eyes with a napkin she had taken from her own diner. Grace looked at Daniel. "You asked me first this time." "Yes. And if I had said no, I would have put it back in my pocket." She smiled. Progress. After the ceremony, music began near the community kitchen. Not a string quartet, a local jazz band. Adults moved tables aside. Some danced, some watched. Daniel remained in his wheelchair at the edge of the floor. Grace approached. He looked at her carefully. "May I?" She placed one hand in his. "You may." He guided his chair forward. Grace stepped between his knees and rested her hands on his shoulders. They moved slowly beneath the warm yellow lights. No one laughed. No one whispered. No one treated the dance as charity. Around them, the center lived. Coffee poured. Books opened. Doors remained wide. Near the entrance, the elderly investor from the wedding stood beside Samuel. "I should have spoken that day," he said. Samuel nodded. "So should I." The man watched Grace and Daniel turn slowly across the polished concrete. "At least we know now." Samuel looked at him. "Knowing later does not repair silence earlier." The investor lowered his eyes. Samuel's voice softened. "But it can change what you do next." Outside, evening settled over Charlotte. Buses arrived beneath the new shelter. The warehouse windows glowed against the darkening street. Grace rested her cheek against Daniel's. "Do you miss hiding?" she asked. "Sometimes." She pulled back. "Honest answer. You asked for one." "What do you miss?" "The quiet." Grace looked around the crowded room. "This is quiet?" Daniel listened. Laughter near the kitchen. Pages turning in the reading room. Wheelchair tires moving across the floor. Coffee cups touching wooden tables. "No," he said. Grace smiled. "But it feels safe." Daniel held her a little closer. "It does." The silver phoenix caught the last light from the windows. A year earlier, people had mocked Grace because they thought she had married a powerless man. Later, they respected Daniel because they discovered his fortune. But in the end, neither money nor public recognition made their marriage whole. Truth did. Accountability did. The courage to see another person before judging what they could offer did. Grace looked across the center at the people who had once been walked past and were now welcoming others through open doors. Then she looked down at the man she had chosen before the world understood him. She had not married a wheelchair. She had not married a billionaire. She had married Daniel. And at last, Daniel had learned to let that be enough. If you had been standing in that wedding's ballroom before anyone knew who Daniel was, would you have remained silent? Or would you have stood beside Grace when Daniel placed the silver phoenix pin on Grace's jacket at the opening of the Common Ground Center? It wasn't wealth changing hands. It was gratitude finally catching up with the woman who had seen his worth long before anyone else did. This story reminds us that dignity doesn't come from money, titles, or the applause of a crowd. It comes from the quiet way we choose to treat another human being when there's nothing to gain and no audience watching. Today, think about one person you usually pass without really seeing. A cashier, a neighbor, a bus driver, or someone sitting alone. Offer a kind word, a patient moment, or simply your attention. Because that's exactly where Grace's quiet strength began. I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you had been one of those wedding guests, would you have spoken up for Grace before anyone knew Daniel was a billionaire CEO? Tell me honestly in the comments below. And stay with us, because the next story begins with another ordinary moment that hides a life-changing truth no one sees coming.